The rivers knew them first, these strangers from the north who would shape a nation's destiny. Down the Dnieper and the Volga they came, their longships cutting through waters that had flowed unchanged since time began. The Varangians, as the local Slavs called these Viking traders and warriors, brought more than goods from distant lands. They brought the seed of empire. In the year 862, as Byzantine chroniclers carefully recorded, and as oral traditions passed from grandmother to grandchild would remember, the Slavic tribes did something remarkable. Exhausted by endless feuding, they sent envoys north with an invitation that would echo through the centuries. Our land is great and rich, but there is no order in it. Come and rule over us. Thus came Rurik, a Varangian prince whose name would become legend. He established himself in Novgorod, that proud city of merchants and free men, while his kinsmen spread south along the river roads. But it was Oleg, called the Wise, who would unite the river route from Novgorod to Kiev and create what we now remember as Kievan Rus, the mother of all Russian states. Kiev, even speaking the name, conjures images of golden domes reflected in the broad Dnieper, of merchants from Constantinople haggling with fur traders from the far north. By the 10th century, this city had become the beating heart of a loose confederation of principalities, each ruled by princes of Rurik's blood, each connected by the silver threads of rivers and the iron bonds of kinship. The Rus, as they came to be known perhaps from the Finnish word for the Swedes, perhaps from the Greek word for red, were pagans who worshipped Perun the thunderer and Velas of the underworld. Their princes kept multiple wives, offered sacrifices in sacred groves, and measured wealth in silver, slaves, and swords. Yet they traded with Christians, Muslims, and Jews alike, their longships and caravans connecting the Baltic to the Black Sea, the forests of the north to the markets of Baghdad. But empires are built on more than trade routes and warrior prowess. They require a shared vision, a common faith that binds diverse peoples into one. For Kievan Rus, that transformation began with a prince whose appetite for life was matched only by his hunger for meaning. Vladimir IV, grandson of the legendary Princess Olga, who had herself converted to Christianity, ascended to Kiev's throne in 980 after a bloody civil war against his brothers. The chronicles tell us he was a man of enormous appetites for power, for women, for life itself. He kept hundreds of concubines, erected massive idols to the old gods, and ruled with a mixture of cunning and brutality that would become the hallmark of Russian leadership. Yet something stirred in Vladimir's soul. Perhaps it was the memory of his grandmother Olga, who had travelled to Constantinople and returned transformed. Perhaps it was the realization that the old tribal gods could no longer unite an increasingly complex state. The chronicles tell us that in 987 Vladimir sent envoys to examine the great religions of the world. They found Islam too restrictive. Drinking is the joy of the Rus, Vladimir supposedly declared. Judaism seemed the faith of a people without land. But when his envoys entered the Hagia Sophia in Constantinople, they wrote back, "We knew not whether we were in heaven or on earth. We only know that God dwells there among men." In 988, in an act that would reshape the spiritual landscape of Eastern Europe, Vladimir accepted baptism in the Byzantine rite. The conversion was both personal and political. He gained the hand of Byzantine Emperor's sister, Anna Porphyrogenita, and brought his entire realm into the orbit of Constantinople's sophisticated civilization. The old idols were cast into the Dnieper, and the people of Kiev were marched into the river for mass baptism. Some went willingly, drawn by their prince's example or the beauty of the new faith. Others were driven by spears. Thus Byzantine Christianity came to the steppes, bringing with it not just a new god, but a new conception of power. The prince was no longer merely a war leader elected by his Druzhina, his warrior band. He was God's anointed, ruling by divine right. Churches rose where pagan temples had stood. Greek priests brought literacy, law codes, and the haunting melodies of Orthodox liturgy. The Cyrillic alphabet, adapted from Greek letters by the missionaries Cyril and Methodius, gave the Slavs a written language that would preserve their stories, their laws, and their prayers. Under Vladimir's son, Yaroslav the Wise, Kievan Rus reached its golden zenith. Yaroslav was that rarest of medieval rulers, a warrior who preferred books to battles, a prince who understood that true power lay not just in the sword but in the scripture, the law code, and the marriage alliance. During his reign from 1019 to 1054, Kiev became one of the great cities of Europe. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, built to rival its namesake in Constantinople, crowned the city with golden domes that caught the first light of dawn and held the last rays of sunset. Yaroslav's daughters married kings of France, Hungary, and Norway. His library was said to be the finest north of Constantinople. His law code, the Russkaya Pravda, brought a measure of justice to a land where might had always made right. Foreign visitors marvelled at Kiev's 400 churches, its 8 marketplaces, its schools and monasteries. Here was a city that could stand beside Paris or Constantinople without shame. Yet even as Yaroslav lay dying in 1054, the seeds of destruction were already sprouting. Following steppe tradition, he divided his realm among his 5 sons, hoping they would rule in harmony. Instead, he inaugurated 2 centuries of fratricidal warfare that would tear Kievan Rus apart like wolves fighting over a carcass. The principle seemed logical enough. Each son received a principality, with the eldest gaining Kiev and nominal supremacy. But what happened when that eldest died? Did his son inherit, or did the throne pass to the dead prince's next brother? The system, called Rota, created a deadly game of musical thrones. Uncles fought nephews, brothers betrayed brothers, and alliances shifted like sand in the wind. By the 12th century, Kievan Rus had fractured into a dozen warring principalities. Vladimir Suzdal in the northeast, Galicia Volhynia in the southwest, Novgorod with its merchant republic in the north. Each pursued its own interests, each claimed the legacy of old Kiev. The great city itself became a prize to be seized and sacked, changing hands with bewildering frequency. As the princes exhausted themselves in endless civil wars, they failed to notice the storm gathering in the east. The Polovtsi, nomadic horsemen of the steppes, pressed ever harder against the frontiers. Trade routes that had brought wealth now brought raiders. The chronicles speak of burned churches, enslaved populations, and fields left fallow for fear of attack. But the Polovtsi were merely the harbinger of something far more terrible. Beyond them, in the vast grasslands of Mongolia, a leader was rising whose name would become synonymous with destruction. Temujin, who would take the title Genghis Khan, was forging the disparate Mongol tribes into the most fearsome military machine the world had ever seen. The Russian princes, locked in their petty squabbles, had no conception of what was coming. They continued to fight among themselves even as refugees began arriving from the east, with tales of a new enemy. Warriors who could shoot arrows with deadly accuracy from galloping horses, who moved faster than news of their coming, who left pyramids of skulls to mark their passage. In 1223, a Mongol reconnaissance force appeared on the steppes. A coalition of Russian princes, momentarily setting aside their feuds, joined with their old enemies the Polovtsi to meet this new threat at the Kalka River. The result was catastrophe. The Mongol feigned retreat, a tactic that would fool European armies for decades to come, then wheeled and destroyed the pursuing Russians. Princes were captured and crushed under the wooden platform on which the Mongol generals feasted in celebration. Yet even this disaster failed to unite the Russian principalities. The Mongols vanished back into the steppes, and the princes returned to their feuds, convincing themselves that the threat had passed. They had 14 years to prepare for what was coming. They spent it fighting each other. As our story moves forward, we must pause to feel the weight of what was about to befall the lands of the Rus. Imagine cities that had stood for centuries reduced to ash in days. Picture chronicles that simply end mid-sentence, their authors dead or fled. Think of a civilization that had been reaching toward the light suddenly plunged into darkness so profound that even its name would be forgotten, replaced by a new word whispered in terror, the Tatar yoke. But from the east, hoofbeats thundered across the steppes, and this time they would not turn back. Winter came early to Ryazan in 1237, but it was not the cold that made the watchmen on the wooden walls tremble. The refugees had been arriving for weeks, wild-eyed survivors speaking of a host beyond counting, of arrows that darkened the sun, of cities that simply ceased to exist. Now, as December snow began to fall, the watchman saw dark lines appearing on the white horizon, growing thicker, spreading like spilled ink across parchment. The Mongols had come. What swept across the Russian lands between 1237 and 1240 was not merely an invasion, it was an apocalypse that would sear itself into the very soul of a people. Batu Khan, grandson of Genghis, led an army perfected in the conquest of China and Central Asia, refined in the destruction of the Khwarezmian Empire, and now turned with terrible purpose toward the divided principalities of the Rus. Ruzan fell first. The princes had laughed at Mongol envoys demanding submission 1/10 of everything, including the princes themselves. When we are dead, they replied proudly, you may have it all. The Mongols took them at their word. After 5 days of siege, the city walls were breached. What followed was so thorough that archaeologists would find layers of ash feet thick, mixed with melted gold from church domes and the small bones of children. The entire population, man, woman, child, was methodically slaughtered. Where Ryazan had stood, only wind-blown snow remained. The catastrophe unfolded with the inevitability of winter itself. Vladimir, the great city of northeastern Rus, fell in February 1238. Prince Yurythek had fled to gather an army, leaving his family sheltering in the city's cathedral. As the Mongols broke through the walls, the royal family and crowds of citizens barricaded themselves inside the church, praying for deliverance. The Mongols simply set it ablaze. The chronicles record that the screams could be heard above the roar of flames, then silence. Suzdal, Rostov, Yaroslavl, ancient cities, fell like wheat before the scythe. The Mongols had perfected siege warfare in China, using Chinese engineers to build catapults that could hurl stones weighing hundreds of pounds. Russian wooden walls, adequate against rival princes, crumbled like parchment. More terrifying still was Mongol discipline. This was no horde of wild barbarians, but a precisely organized military machine. Units of 10, 100, 1,000, and 10,000 moved in perfect coordination. Orders were absolute. A warrior who retreated without command was executed, along with his entire unit. In March 1238, Prince Yuri made his stand on the Sit River. The battle was less a fight than a hunt. Mongol mounted archers, able to fire with deadly accuracy at full gallop, surrounded the Russian force. They fired arrow after arrow into the packed ranks, staying always out of reach of Russian swords. When Russian cavalry charged, the Mongols simply melted away, firing over their shoulders the famous Parthian shot, only to wheel and attack from another direction. By sunset, the prince lay dead among thousands of his men. The snow, witnesses said, was so soaked with blood it steamed in the cold air. Only the coming of spring saved Novgorod. The Mongols, fearing their horses would bog down in the notorious Russian mud season, turned back just 100 kilometers from the city. But they would return. They always returned. Kiev's turn came in 1240. The city that had once been the jewel of Rus, the city of 400 churches and golden domes, stood no chance. Batu Khan himself directed the siege, fascinated by the city's beauty even as he orchestrated its destruction. For days the thunder of catapults never ceased. When the walls finally fell on December 6th, the slaughter was so complete that 6 years later, a papal envoy passing through counted only 200 houses standing in what had been one of Europe's greatest cities. The Cathedral of St. Sophia, Yaroslavl's pride, was left a hollow shell, its priests dead, its treasures melted or stolen, its famous library burned or scattered to the winds. And then, as suddenly as they had come, the Mongols withdrew to the steppes. But they did not leave. On the lower Volga they established the Khanate of the Golden Horde Golden for the magnificent tent of the Khan, and from there they would rule the Russian lands for the next 2.5 centuries. This was the beginning of what Russians would call the Tatar yoke. Though the Mongols were not Tatars, that was simply the name of one tribe that had been absorbed into their empire. But the misnomer stuck, becoming synonymous with oppression, humiliation, and the slow crushing of the Russian spirit. The yoke was not the direct rule of occupation, but something more insidious, a system of control through terror and taxation, that would fundamentally reshape Russian society. Princes who wished to rule had to travel to Sarai, the Khan's capital, to receive a yarlik, a patent of authority. There they would grovel before the Khan, competing with other princes in displays of submission, offering gifts, offering daughters, offering anything to gain favour. Some never returned executed for real or imagined offences, or simply to remind others of the Khan's absolute power. The psychological impact was devastating. These were men whose ancestors had married into the royal houses of Europe, who had seen themselves as equals to any monarch in Christendom. Now they prostrated themselves before pagans, kissing the ground at the Khan's feet. The humiliation bred a toxic mixture of shame and cunning, teaching Russian rulers that survival meant absolute obedience upward and absolute control downward. The Mongols demanded tribute silver, furs, slaves, anything of value. They conducted censuses, counting every household, every soul, with a thoroughness that would not be matched until modern times. Those who could not pay were enslaved. Those who resisted were destroyed with a savagery calculated to discourage others. When the city of Tver rebelled in 1327, the Mongols didn't merely suppress the rebellion, they erased Tver so completely that grass grew in its streets. Yet from this crucible of suffering, Moscow began its unlikely rise. A minor principality before the conquest, Moscow possessed two advantages: shrewd princes and strategic location at the centre of river trade routes. The princes of Moscow-Ivan Tharan, called Kalita or moneybags, discovered that collaboration paid better than resistance. They became the Khan's tax collectors, gathering tribute from other Russian principalities. When payments were late, it was Moscow's princes who led Mongol punitive expeditions against their fellow Russians. This collaboration was both shameful and brilliant. Each time Moscow collected taxes, it kept a portion. Each time it punished another principality, it weakened a rival. Slowly, quietly, like snow accumulating on a winter night, Moscow gathered wealth and power. The Church, seeking stability, moved its metropolitan seat to Moscow. Refugees from devastated regions seeking protection swelled its population. The Mongol yoke taught Russians lessons that would echo through centuries. It taught them that power was not to be shared but concentrated, that mercy was weakness, that survival required not just strength but cunning. It taught them to endure, to bear suffering that would break other peoples, to wait with patience measured not in years but in generations. The Russian word nichevo, it is nothing, or more deeply, it cannot be helped, became a philosophy of survival. Under the yoke, Russians developed what historians would later call a dual consciousness, one face for the master, another for themselves. They learned to hide their true thoughts, to speak in whispers, to trust no one completely. The knout, the Mongol whip, became the symbol of authority. The very word Kremlin, meaning fortress, spread across the land as each city built higher walls, not against foreign invaders, but against the arbitrary violence that might come from any direction. Yet even in this darkness, seeds of future greatness were being planted. The Orthodox Church, which the Mongols largely left alone as long as it preached submission, became the keeper of Russian identity. In monasteries hidden deep in forests, monks preserved not just prayers, but chronicles, laws, and the memory of what Rus had been. The people, driven together by shared suffering, began to think of themselves not as men of Novgorod or Kiev or Vladimir, but simply as Russians. And in Moscow, the descendants of collaborators were learning the art of empire. They studied their masters well, their military organization, their system of absolute rule, their use of terror as a tool of governance. When the time came to throw off the yoke, they would use Mongol methods against the Mongols themselves. The oppressed, as so often happens in history, had learned too well from their oppressors. As we watch Moscow's quiet rise, we see one of history's great ironies taking shape. The city that gained power by serving foreign masters would one day rule an empire that dwarfed even the Mongols' vast domains. But the price of that future glory was paid in the currency of present humiliation, and the interest on that debt would compound through centuries of autocracy and suffering. The coins clinked softly in the leather pouches as Ivan Kalita counted them by candlelight. Each silver piece represented a family's suffering, a village's sweat, a principality's submission. But to Ivan, Prince of Moscow from 1325 to 1340, they represented something more, the patient accumulation of power, coin by coin, village by village, until Moscow would hold all the strings of Russian destiny. His nickname, Kalita, meaning money bag, was meant as mockery by other princes, even wore it as prophecy. Where his predecessors had raged against the Mongol yoke, Ivan bowed deeper. Where others plotted rebellion, he calculated profit. His genius lay not in heroic gestures, but in understanding a fundamental truth. In a land crushed by foreign domination, the man who controls the money controls the future. As the Khan's chief tax collector, Ivan transformed humiliation into opportunity. When princes couldn't pay their tribute, Ivan paid it for them, in exchange for their lands. When cities faced Mongol wrath, Ivan interceded for a price. Slowly, inexorably, like a spider spinning its web, Moscow extended its reach. The church blessed this accumulation. Metropolitan Peter, seeking stability in chaos, had moved the spiritual center of Russia to Moscow. When he died, Ivan built the Cathedral of the Assumption to house his tomb, making Moscow not just a political but a sacred center. Pilgrims who came to pray at Peter's shrine spent money in Moscow's markets. Nobles seeking the metropolitan's blessing built houses near the Kremlin. What had been a wooden fort on a hill became the heart of a growing power. Ivan's successors continued his patient work. They had learned the Mongol lesson well: never appear strong enough to be a threat. Always appear useful enough to be preserved. They married wisely, inherited cleverly, purchased constantly. When other princes died without heirs, somehow Moscow always had the strongest claim. When the Golden Horde split into competing khanates, Moscow played them against each other with skills learned from centuries of subjugation. But subservience, no matter how profitable, gnaws at the soul. By 1380, when Dmitry Donskoy ruled Moscow, something had changed in the Russian spirit. Perhaps it was the sight of Mongol Khans fighting each other. Perhaps it was the growing strength of Moscow's stone Kremlin. Or perhaps it was simply that enough generations had passed for fear to transform into anger. When Mamai, a Mongol general, demanded unprecedented tribute, Dmitry did something his ancestors would have thought suicidal. He refused. The armies met at Kulikovo Field on September 8, 1380, where the Don River makes a great bend. The night before battle, Russian soldiers confessed their sins, knowing that few would see another sunset. Dmitry, so the chronicles tell us, exchanged armour with a simple boyar and fought in the front ranks like a common soldier. The battle raged from morning until afternoon, a grinding, brutal affair of arrow storms and cavalry charges, of men dying in the autumn mud for an idea that had been dormant for 140 years, that Russians could stand against their oppressors. The key moment came when Prince Vladimir of Serpukhov, commanding a hidden reserve force, struck the Mongol flank. The enemy line, stretched thin after hours of combat, shattered like ice in spring. For the first time in living memory, Russians watched Mongol warriors flee. The victory was so unexpected, so impossible, that soldiers fell to their knees in the blood-soaked field, weeping prayers of thanksgiving. Yet Kulikovo was not liberation. It was merely the first crack in the prison wall. 2 years later, Tokhtamysh Khan burned Moscow in retaliation, and the tribute resumed. But something fundamental had shifted. Russians had remembered that they could fight. The myth of Mongol invincibility lay broken in the mud of Kulikovo Field. The gathering of Russian lands now had a purpose beyond mere accumulation. It was preparation for freedom. That freedom would come through Ivan III, called the Great, who ruled from 1462 to 1505. If Ivan Kalita had been the patient merchant, Ivan the Great was the imperial visionary. He inherited a Moscow that controlled perhaps 15,000 square miles. He left it controlling 55,000. But mere territory tells only part of the story. Ivan transformed Moscow from a principality into an idea, the idea of Russia itself. His marriage in 1472 to Sophia Palaiologus was a masterstroke of symbolic politics. She was the niece of the last Byzantine emperor, Constantine the Eternth, who had died defending Constantinople against the Turks in 1453. With Byzantium fallen and Constantinople the second Rome in Muslim hands, Ivan positioned Moscow as the inheritor of Roman imperial authority. The double-headed eagle of Byzantium became Moscow's emblem, looking both east and west, past and future. Court ceremonies grew elaborate with Byzantine ritual. He even began calling himself sovereign of all Rus, then Sir Caesar. The monk Philotheus captured this transformation in a letter that would echo through Russian history. 2 Romes have fallen, the third stands, and there will be no fourth. Moscow was not merely a city or even a kingdom. It was the last bastion of true Christianity, the final empire before the world's end. This messianic vision would justify any expansion, any cruelty, any sacrifice. Russia was not conquering, it was fulfilling God's plan. But first, the Mongol yoke had to be finally, formally broken. By 1480, the Golden Horde was a shadow of its former self, weakened by internal strife and pressure from other steppe peoples. When Khan Ahmed demanded traditional tribute, Ivan did more than refuse. He reportedly threw the Khan's portrait to the ground and trampled it. Such theatrical defiance would have meant death for his ancestors. For Ivan, it meant war. The armies met at the Ugra River in October 1480, in what history remembers as the Great Stand. For weeks, Russians on one bank faced Mongols on the other, neither side eager to attempt a crossing under arrow fire. As autumn deepened into winter, the river began to freeze. In past centuries, this would have favoured the Mongols, masters of winter warfare. But now it was the Russians who waited patiently, comfortable in their own cold. What happened next remains one of history's anticlimaxes. One morning, both armies began withdrawing. Perhaps Khan Ahmed received news of attacks on his undefended capital. Perhaps Ivan's bribes to the Khan's enemies had taken effect. Perhaps both sides simply recognized that the world had changed. The Mongols withdrew to the steppes and never returned. After 240 years, the yoke was broken, not with a great battle, but with a mutual recognition that an era had ended. Yet as Moscow's church bells rang in celebration, as prayers of thanksgiving rose to heaven, wise men might have pondered what kind of state had emerged from centuries of oppression. Moscow had learned too well from its masters. The centralized power, the crushing of dissent, the use of terror as governance, all these Mongol gifts had been absorbed into Russian statecraft. The princes who had once collected tribute for foreign khans would now collect it for themselves, with the same ruthless efficiency. We stand now at a threshold. Russia was free, but freedom would bring its own chains. The habits of autocracy, learned in subjugation, would prove harder to break than any foreign yoke. The Third Rome would rise, magnificent and terrible, but it would rule its subjects with methods the Mongols would have recognized and approved. In throwing off their oppressors, the Russians had become them. This is the tragedy that would play out over the coming centuries. A people who confuse strength with cruelty, unity with uniformity, greatness with fear. The boy stood in the shadows of the Kremlin palace, watching. Always watching. At 3 years old, Sven had lost his father. At 8, poison had taken his mother, leaving him alone in a court of wolves dressed as nobles. The boyars who ruled in his name treated him like a beggar in his own palace, denying him food, clothes, even warmth in the brutal Moscow winters. They lounged on his father's throne, feet up, laughing as the child who would one day rule them shivered in rags. These early years carved something into Ivan's soul, wound that would never heal, a rage that would one day consume an empire. They say trauma shapes us all, but rarely has childhood suffering forged so terrible a weapon. Young Ivan found solace in 2 things, reading and cruelty. He devoured chronicles of ancient rulers Caesar, Alexander, Constantine, learning that power meant the ability to inspire not just respect, but terror. For amusement, he threw dogs from the Kremlin walls, watching them writhe in the snow below. The boyars laughed, thinking him merely a disturbed child. They did not recognize they were watching their future executioner practice his craft. On January 16, 1547, Ivan was crowned in the Cathedral of the Assumption. He was 16 years old, and he insisted on a title no Russian ruler had formally claimed before, Tsar of all Russia. Not Grand Prince, not Duke to Tsar, Caesar, Emperor. As the Metropolitan placed the crown of Monomach upon his head, those who knew the young man felt a chill that had nothing to do with winter. His eyes, witnesses would later recall, held both the brightness of intelligence and the darkness of madness. The early years of his reign showed promise of greatness without the shadow of terror. Ivan surrounded himself with good advisers, the priest Sylvester and the nobleman Adadashev, who formed what became known as the Chosen Council. Together they enacted reforms that modernized the creaking machinery of Russian government. A new law code, the Sudebnik of 1550, brought order to legal chaos. The Streltsy, Russia's first permanent military units, gave Moscow a professional army. Local government was reorganized, giving communities a voice in their own administration. But Ivan's true genius, and his curse lay in understanding that Russia's destiny lay beyond its borders. In 1552 he turned his attention to Kazan, the Tatar Khanate that had tormented Russia for centuries. The siege was a masterpiece of military planning. Ivan brought 150,000 men and 150 cannons, a massive force for the era. Russian engineers, some trained by Italian masters, dug tunnels under Kazan's walls and packed them with gunpowder. When the explosions came, they could be heard 30 miles away. The final assault on October 2, 1552 was savage beyond description. Ivan had promised his troops unlimited plunder, and they took him at his word. The slaughter was so complete that the Volga ran red for days. Yet in victory Ivan showed a different face. He ordered the construction of St. Basil's Cathedral in Red Square, its fantastic onion domes celebrating the conquest, while its beauty seemed to seek forgiveness for the blood spilled. The architect, legend tells us, was blinded on Ivan's orders so he could never create anything more beautiful. Beauty and cruelty, creation and destruction. Always with Ivan, the two were inseparable. 4 years later, Astrakhan fell, giving Russia control of the entire Volga and opening the road to the Caspian Sea. Ivan had done what centuries of his predecessors had failed to do, reversed the tide of conquest. Where once Tatars had ruled Russians, now Russians ruled Tatars. The empire was being born, baptized in blood and sanctified by victory. But something was breaking inside Ivan's mind. Perhaps it was the death of his beloved first wife Anastasia in 1560. He was convinced she had been poisoned by the Boyars. Perhaps it was the betrayal of his closest advisers, who fled when his behaviour became increasingly erratic. Or perhaps the madness had always been there, waiting. In 1564, Ivan did something unprecedented. He abdicated, leaving Moscow for a fortified monastery and sending back 2 letters. One to the church and nobles listed their sins against him. The other to the common people assured them of his love. Moscow fell into chaos. Without the Tsar, who would protect them from the Boyars, from foreign enemies? Delegations of citizens begged Ivan to return. He agreed, but only on his own terms. He would divide Russia in 2. Part would be ruled normally. The other part, the Oprichnina, meaning apart from, would be his personal domain, ruled by his personal army, answerable only to him. The Oprichniki were Russia's first secret police, and they perfected terror as an instrument of state. Dressed in black, riding black horses, they carried the severed head of a dog and a broom on their saddle symbols that they would sniff out treason and sweep it away. Their methods were simple and effective. Accusation meant guilt. Guilt meant death. Whole families were exterminated to prevent revenge. Estates were confiscated, populations relocated, cities destroyed on mere suspicion. The madness reached its peak in 1570 with the destruction of Novgorod. Ivan suspected the ancient city of planning to defect to Lithuania. For 5 weeks the Oprichniki tortured and murdered. Men were roasted alive, women and children thrown through holes in the frozen river. The death toll ran into the thousands, some say tens of thousands. Novgorod, once Russia's proudest free city, never recovered. As Ivan watched the executions, he reportedly kept careful lists, not from guilt, but to ensure he could pray for the souls of the dead. Even in madness he remained pious. Yet the same man who ordered such horrors also exchanged learned letters with European monarchs, discussing theology and philosophy. He established Russia's first printing press, patronized artists and architects, and could quote scripture and classical authors from memory. This was no simple brute, but a complex, tormented soul whose intelligence only made his cruelty more terrible. He knew what he was doing was evil. His letters are full of self-recrimination. Yet, he could not stop. The personal tragedy that would define Ivan's legacy came on November 19, 1581. In a rage over some trivial matter, perhaps his son's wife's clothing, perhaps a disagreement over military strategy, Ivan struck his eldest son and heir, also named Ivan, with his iron-tipped staff. The blow was fatal. As the younger Ivan lay dying in his arms, the Tsar howled like a wounded animal. He had killed his dynasty's future with his own hands. The remaining years were a descent into paranoid madness. Ivan would alternate between orgies of violence and paroxysms of religious guilt, sometimes ordering executions in the morning and spending the night in prayer for his victims. He died on March 18, 1584, while setting up a chess game. Some say he was poisoned. Mercury levels in his remains are extraordinarily high. Others believe his body simply gave out, exhausted by a lifetime of rage. What Ivan left behind was a paradox that would define Russia for centuries. He had expanded the empire dramatically by his death. Russia was the largest country in Europe. He had broken the power of the boyars, creating a centralized autocracy that recognized no limits on the Tsar's power. He had proven that Russia could be a great power, conquering ancient enemies and commanding respect through fear. But the price had been catastrophic. Whole regions lay depopulated. The economy was in ruins. The nobility that might have evolved into a check on royal power had been terrorized into servility. Most fatally, Ivan had established the principle that Russian greatness required Russian suffering, that the empire's glory justified any cruelty, that to rule Russia meant to break Russia. Every future Tsar would wrestle with Ivan's legacy, the terrible equation that absolute power seemed necessary for Russian survival, yet absolute power corrupted absolutely. As Ivan's body lay in state, his surviving son Fyodor, weak in body and mind, prepared to assume a throne soaked in blood. The dynasty that had ruled for 7 centuries was dying, and in the shadows, ambitious men began to plot. Russia had learned under Ivan that chaos was always waiting, that without an iron hand the empire would devour itself. The time of troubles was approaching, and it would test whether Russia was a nation or merely the possession of whoever could seize and hold the throne. The great wheel of Russian history had turned through blood and chaos, through the death of dynasties and the birth of new orders. The time of troubles had passed like a fever dream, leaving scars but also strength. Peter the Great had dragged Russia kicking and screaming into modernity, building his window to Europe on the bones of serfs and the dreams of an empire that would rival any in the world. But when the Titan died in 1725, he left behind something unprecedented in Russian history, a succession crisis that would, paradoxically, give birth to Russia's most glorious century. What followed was peculiar beyond imagination. For most of the 18th century, the largest empire on earth would be ruled by women, not regents or power behind the throne figures, but empresses in their own right. Women who wielded absolute power with a sophistication and cultural vision their male predecessors could barely have imagined. It was as if Russia, having spent centuries proving its masculine strength through conquest and brutality, suddenly discovered its feminine soul through art, literature, and the subtle diplomacy of courts that rivaled Versailles. Catherine I, Peter's second wife, was the first to break the ancient pattern. A Lithuanian peasant girl who had risen from captivity to become empress of all the Russias, she understood power in ways that noble-born rulers often did not. When Peter died without clearly naming a successor, it was Catherine's supporters among the Guards regiments who seized control. For 2 brief years, 1725 to 1727, this former servant ruled an empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific. She was barely literate, yet she presided over an increasingly sophisticated court, where European manners mixed with Russian traditions like honey swirling through tea. Her death brought a decade of confusion-child emperors and regents, German influences and Russian reactions, until Anna Ivanovna claimed the throne in 1730. Anna's reign was darker, marked by favourites and secret police. Yet even she understood that Russia's future lay not merely in military might, but in cultural prestige. Under her patronage, the first Russian ballet company was founded. Italian architects redesigned St. Petersburg's skyline, and the Academy of Sciences began attracting scholars from across Europe. But it was Elizabeth, Peter's daughter, who truly inaugurated Russia's golden age when she seized power in 1741. Elizabeth was everything her father had been, and everything he had not, a woman of enormous energy and appetite for life, yet possessed of an artistic sensibility that transformed the imperial court into a showcase of European sophistication. She spoke French as fluently as Russian, corresponded with Voltaire, and understood that true power in the 18th century came not just from armies, but from the ability to inspire admiration, even envy, in other courts. Under Elizabeth, palace coups became almost a Russian art form. The Guards regiments, those elite units created by Peter the Great, discovered they could make and unmake emperors with a few well-timed arrests and proclamations. This was not chaos, but a peculiar form of Russian constitutionalism. The Guards represented the nobility's interests, and their approval became essential for any ruler's legitimacy. It was democracy of a sort. If democracy consisted of a few thousand armed aristocrats deciding the empire's fate over vodka and midnight conspiracies. Yet these coups, dramatic as they were, barely disturbed the deeper currents of cultural transformation. Elizabeth's court became a magnet for talent from across Europe. The Italian architect Bartolomeo Rastrelli designed the Winter Palace, that jewel of Baroque architecture whose gold and azure facade seemed to capture sunlight itself. French became the language of polite society. German scholars filled the Academy of Sciences. English merchants found ready markets for their goods. Russia was becoming European not through Peter's brutal reforms, but through the subtler alchemy of cultural attraction. The flowering was most evident in the arts. Russian nobles, no longer content to be mere landowners or military officers, began to see themselves as patrons of literature and music. The first Russian university was founded at Moscow in 1755. Russian poets began writing verse that could stand comparison with anything produced in Paris or London. Mikhail Lomonosov, the fisherman's son who became Russia's first great scientist and poet, embodied this transformation, a man who could write an ode celebrating Russian grammar with the same passion he brought to his experiments in chemistry and physics. Architecture told the story of Russia's evolving identity. The Petrine Baroque of Elizabeth's reign was exuberant, confident, almost boastful. Russia announcing to Europe that it could build as magnificently as any nation. The Winter Palace, the Catherine Palace at Tsarskoye Selo, the Smolny Cathedral. These were not mere buildings, but declarations that Russia had found its voice in stone and gold. Walking through these palaces, foreign ambassadors understood immediately that they were dealing with a great power that possessed not just military might but cultural sophistication. Yet beneath this glittering surface, the fundamental contradictions of Russian society remained unresolved. The same empress who corresponded with philosophers about human rights owned millions of serfs. The court that celebrated reason and enlightenment was supported by the labour of peasants, who lived in conditions barely distinguishable from slavery. Russian nobles who read Voltaire in their St. Petersburg palaces returned to estates where they exercised absolute power over human beings they could buy, sell, or beat at will. This contradiction would reach its fullest expression in Catherine II, who would ascend the throne in 1762 through yet another palace coup. But Elizabeth's reign had prepared the stage for this final act of the Age of Empresses. She had proven that Russia could be both powerful and cultured, that the empire could inspire admiration as well as fear. She had created a court culture that attracted the best minds of Europe, while nurturing Russia's own emerging artistic genius. The phenomenon of female rule in 18th century Russia reflected something deeper than mere accidents of succession. These empresses understood instinctively what their male predecessors had often missed, that true imperial power in the modern world required not just the ability to conquer, but the ability to civilize, not just to inspire fear, but to command respect. They transformed Russia from a barely European military monarchy into a cultural centre that could hold its own with Paris, Vienna, or London. As Elizabeth's reign drew to a close, she looked with satisfaction on what she had built. Russia was no longer the crude half-Asian despotism that Europeans had once dismissed. It was a sophisticated empire where ballet dancers from Italy performed for audiences that included some of Europe's finest minds, where Russian poets wrote verses that were read in Paris, where the Winter Palace surpassed Versailles in magnificence if not in taste. She had kept Peter's window to Europe open while making Russia worthy of what it saw through that window. But the age of empresses was not yet over. In the wings waited a German princess who would surpass them all, a woman who would expand the empire to its greatest extent, while wrestling with philosophical questions that would echo through the centuries. Catherine the Great was coming, and with her, the final, most glorious and most contradictory chapter of Russia's golden age. Sophie Friederike Auguste, Princess of Anhalt-Zerbst-Dornburg, arrived in Russia in 1744 as a 14-year-old German bride-to-be, speaking not a word of Russian and knowing nothing of the vast empire she would one day rule. Yet this young woman possessed something that would prove more powerful than noble blood or military genius, an insatiable curiosity about the world and an unshakable belief in her own destiny. By the time she died 48 years later, she would be known as Catherine the Great, the foreign princess who became more Russian than the Russians, the philosopher-empress who expanded the empire to its greatest extent, while wrestling with ideas that would reshape the very conception of power itself. The transformation began almost immediately. While her future husband, the Grand Duke Peter, frittered away his time playing with toy soldiers and dreaming of his native Holstein, Sophie threw herself into becoming Russian. She learned the language with such dedication that she claimed to think in Russian within months. She studied Orthodox theology, converting with apparent sincerity to the Russian faith. Most importantly, she read voraciously, systematically, with the hunger of someone who understood that knowledge was the ultimate form of power. The books that shaped Catherine's worldview came from the pens of the French Enlightenment. Montesquieu on the separation of powers, Voltaire on religious tolerance, Diderot on natural law. She corresponded with these giants of European thought, not as a curious amateur but as an intellectual equal. Her letters to Voltaire sparkle with wit and erudition. Her conversations with Diderot, when the philosopher visited St. Petersburg, were said to last for hours, ranging across politics, literature, and philosophy, with an ease that astounded European observers. Here was an absolute monarch who could discuss the rights of man with those who invented the concept. Yet Catherine was far more than an armchair philosopher. When she seized power in 1762, overthrowing her own husband, Peter III, in a bloodless coup supported by the Guards regiments, she brought to the throne a unique combination of Enlightenment ideals and political realism. Her famous instruction, written in 1767 as a guide for legal reform, reads like a textbook of enlightened despotism. "The sovereign is absolute," she wrote, "for there is no other authority but that which centres in his single person, that can act with a vigour proportionate to the extent of such a vast dominion." Yet in the same document she argued that the equality of the citizens consists in this, that they should all be subject to the same laws. The contradiction was quintessentially Catherine and quintessentially Russian. She genuinely believed in human equality and natural rights. Yet she ruled over a nation where 20 million serfs lived in bondage more complete than anything known in medieval Europe. She corresponded with Voltaire about religious tolerance while presiding over a state where old believers were persecuted and Jews confined to the Pale of Settlement. She spoke eloquently of the rule of law while exercising power so absolute that a word from her could exile families to Siberia or elevate peasants to princely rank. Perhaps nowhere was this contradiction more evident than in her relationship with Gregory Potemkin, the one-eyed giant who became her lover, minister, and possibly her secret husband. Potemkin understood Catherine's dual nature perfectly, her genuine commitment to Enlightenment principles, and her equally genuine need to maintain absolute power. Together, they created what became known as Potemkin villages, elaborate facades designed to impress foreign visitors with Russia's prosperity and progress. The term entered the language as a synonym for deception, yet the villages themselves reflected a deeper truth about Catherine's Russia, the empire's eternal struggle between appearance and reality, between the ideals it proclaimed and the methods it employed. Under Catherine's rule, the empire expanded dramatically. The conquest of Crimea in 1783 gave Russia access to the warm water ports that had eluded every previous ruler. The partitions of Poland, carried out with Prussia and Austria, added vast territories and millions of new subjects. Russian explorers pushed into Alaska and down the Pacific coast as far as California. By Catherine's death, Russia stretched from the Baltic to the Black Sea, from the Arctic Ocean to the Caucasus Mountains. It was an empire to rival Rome at its height, yet expansion came at a terrible cost, not just in blood and treasure, but in the moral compromise that power demands. The Pugachev Rebellion of 1773-1775 revealed the depth of popular discontent with Catherine's enlightened despotism. Emelian Pugachev, a Don Cossack who claimed to be the murdered Peter III, raised a rebellion that swept across southeastern Russia like wildfire. Serfs, Cossacks, religious minorities and ethnic groups oppressed by Russian expansion flocked to his banner. For 2 years, Pugachev's forces controlled vast territories, promising to end serfdom and restore ancient freedoms. Catherine's response revealed both her strength and her limitations. She crushed the rebellion with characteristic efficiency. Pugachev was captured, brought to Moscow in a cage, and executed in Red Square. But the uprising had shaken her profoundly. She who corresponded with philosophes about human dignity had seen her own subjects rise in desperate revolt against conditions she'd done nothing to improve. The peasants she theoretically loved had tried to kill her representatives and burn her cities. The rebellion marked the end of Catherine's most liberal period. The Charter to the Nobility, issued in 1785, legally enshrined aristocratic privileges while further restricting peasant rights. Serfdom became more rather than less oppressive under the great liberal empress. When confronted with this contradiction by critics, Catherine's response was characteristically honest. "I am an aristocrat. It is my profession." She understood that her enlightened ideals could not survive the destruction of the social order that supported them. The French Revolution put Catherine's philosophy to its ultimate test. The same woman who had praised Voltaire's attacks on religious fanaticism now banned his works when revolution erupted in France. The Empress, who had corresponded warmly with Diderot, now viewed French philosophy as a dangerous contagion that might infect her subjects with democratic ideas. When news arrived of Louis XVI's execution, Catherine reportedly suffered a stroke from the shock. The Enlightenment had devoured its own children, and Catherine wanted nothing more to do with it. Yet even in reaction, Catherine remained remarkable. Her art collection, acquired during her correspondence with European intellectuals, formed the core of what would become the Hermitage, one of the world's great museums. Her architectural projects transformed St. Petersburg into a city that truly rivaled Paris in magnificence. The Academy of Sciences flourished under her patronage, attracting scholars from across Europe. Russian literature began to find its voice in the works of writers like Denis von Vizin and Gavrila Derzhavin, who created a distinctly Russian literary tradition. Most importantly, Catherine established the principle that Russia must be both European and Russian, that the empire could maintain its unique character while participating fully in European civilization. This delicate balance between Eastern and Western traditions, between autocracy and enlightenment, between imperial ambition and cultural sophistication, would define Russian identity for generations to come. When Catherine died on November 17, 1796, she left behind an empire at the height of its power and influence. Russian armies were feared from Stockholm to Istanbul. Russian diplomats were courted in every European capital. Russian culture was admired from Paris to Vienna. She had achieved what Peter the Great had only dreamed of, making Russia not just a great power but a great civilization. Yet the contradictions she embodied remained unresolved and would prove to be time bombs ticking in the heart of the Russian system. An empire built on Enlightenment principles but sustained by serfdom, an autocracy that proclaimed the rule of law while recognizing no limits on imperial power, a civilization that embraced European culture while rejecting European political ideas. These paradoxes would torment every subsequent ruler and ultimately contribute to the empire's destruction. As her son Paul prepared to inherit the throne, Europe was convulsing with revolutionary change. The old world of absolute monarchs and hereditary privilege was under assault from ideas that Catherine herself had once embraced. Russia would soon face its greatest test not from foreign armies, but from the logical consequences of its own contradictions. The age of enlightened despotism was ending, and the age of revolution was about to begin. Alexander ascended the Russian throne in 1801 carrying secrets that would haunt him for life. His father, Paul, had died in a palace coup that Alexander had known about, perhaps even approved. The 23-year-old emperor was thus baptized in the blood of patricide, a guilt that would drive him to seek redemption through mysticism, diplomacy, and ultimately his confrontation with the greatest military genius of his age. Alexander was beautiful, charming, and tormented a man who spoke of liberal reform while ruling as absolutely as any of his predecessors, who yearned for peace while commanding armies across Europe, who sought God's forgiveness while playing the great game of continental politics. The young Tsar's early reign sparkled with promise. Educated by the Swiss tutor Frederick César de la Harpe, Alexander had absorbed Enlightenment ideals even more thoroughly than Catherine the Great. He spoke of constitutional monarchy, of freeing the serfs, of transforming Russia into a modern European state governed by law rather than whim. His court attracted liberal thinkers from across Europe. For a brief moment it seemed as though Russia might evolve peacefully toward the political freedoms that Western Europe was discovering through revolution and reform. But history had other plans. In France, Napoleon Bonaparte was carving out an empire that would challenge every assumption about European politics. The Corsican upstart who had seized power in the chaos of revolution was proving that a single man of genius could reshape the continent through force of will and military brilliance. As Napoleon's armies swept across Italy, Germany, and Austria, Alexander found himself drawn inexorably into a conflict that would test not just Russia's military might, but the very foundations of its social order. The wars that followed, Austerlitz, Friedland, a dozen other battles revealed both Russia's strength and its weaknesses. Russian soldiers fought with a courage that amazed Europe. At Austerlitz in 1805, they charged Napoleon's veterans with such ferocity that the French emperor himself expressed admiration for their valour. Yet courage alone could not overcome Napoleon's tactical genius or the professional competence of armies forged in revolutionary warfare. Russia's defeats were as crushing as they were educational. It was at Tilsit in 1807, meeting on a raft in the middle of the Niemen River, that Alexander first came face to face with Napoleon. The encounter was electric. Two young emperors, each representing a different vision of Europe's future, each fascinated by the other. Napoleon, the self-made emperor who had risen from obscurity, met Alexander, the hereditary autocrat who questioned the very foundations of his inherited power. They talked for hours, dividing Europe between them like schoolboys sharing a map. For a brief moment it seemed as though France and Russia might reshape the continent together. But the Tilsit alliance was built on mutual deception. Napoleon needed peace with Russia to complete his domination of Western Europe. Alexander needed time to rebuild his armies and reform his administration. Both men knew the partnership was temporary, yet both were seduced by the possibility that it might become something more. Their correspondence during these years reveals a complex dance of diplomacy, each man probing the other's intentions while concealing his own. The alliance collapsed over economics and ego. Napoleon's continental system, designed to strangle British trade, was ruining Russian merchants who had grown wealthy exporting grain and timber to Britain. Alexander's gradual withdrawal from the system signalled to Napoleon that war was inevitable. Both empires began preparing for a conflict that would determine the fate of Europe. When Napoleon invaded Russia in June 1812, he brought with him the largest army ever assembled, nearly 700,000 men drawn from across his empire. Against this host, Russia could field perhaps 200,000 soldiers scattered across a frontier that stretched for hundreds of miles. By every military calculation, the invasion should have ended in Russian defeat within weeks. Instead, it became the beginning of Napoleon's downfall and Russia's emergence as Europe's dominant power. The genius of Russian strategy lay not in what they did, but in what they refused to do. Instead of offering Napoleon the decisive battle he sought, Russian commanders, first Barclay de Tolly, then Kutuzov, traded space for time, drawing the invaders ever deeper into the vast Russian interior. Napoleon found himself chasing phantoms across a landscape that seemed to stretch into infinity. His supply lines growing ever longer, his army bleeding strength with every mile. When battle finally came at Borodino on September 7th, 1812, it was a horror that scarred both armies. Russian and French soldiers fought with a desperation that amazed witnesses. The carnage was so complete that Napoleon himself, hardened by 20 years of warfare, was reportedly sickened by the sight. Yet when the smoke cleared, the Russians had achieved their strategic goal. Napoleon's army was too weakened to hold Russia even if it captured Moscow. The burning of Moscow was the masterstroke that sealed Napoleon's fate. As Alexander had written to his sister, "I would rather retreat to Kamchatka than make peace." When the French entered the ancient capital, they found a city of empty palaces and abandoned churches. Then came the fires, whether set by Russian patriots, French soldiers, or simple accident, no one knows. For 5 days Moscow burned, and with it Napoleon's hopes of a negotiated peace. The retreat that followed became the stuff of legend and nightmare. Winter came early that year, trapping Napoleon's army in a landscape turned hostile. Russian irregular forces, Cossacks, peasant partisans, regular cavalry harassed the retreating columns mercilessly. Disease, cold, and hunger accomplished what Russian armies alone could not. Of the 700,000 men who had crossed the Niemen in June, fewer than 30,000 would return as organized military units. Yet Russia's victory came at a terrible cost. The provinces through which the armies had marched lay devastated. Moscow's destruction had been as painful to Russians as to French. Hundreds of thousands of Russian soldiers and civilians had died defending their homeland. The serfs who had borne the heaviest burden fighting the invaders, burning their own crops, fleeing their homes, remained in bondage despite their sacrifices. Alexander's response to victory revealed both his greatness and his limitations. Convinced that God had chosen him to liberate Europe from Napoleon's tyranny, he led the coalition that would ultimately bring the French emperor down. Russian troops marched across Germany and into France itself. Cossacks watered their horses in the Seine. On March 31st, 1814, Alexander entered Paris in triumph, the liberator of Europe and arbiter of its future. But victory bred its own contradictions. The officers who had seen Paris and Vienna, who had witnessed constitutional governments and free institutions, returned to Russia asking why their homeland remained locked in medieval autocracy. The Decembrist movement, which would challenge Alexander's successor, had its roots in the campfires where Russian officers discussed French liberty and German philosophy. The empire that had saved Europe from Napoleon found itself infected by the very ideas it had fought to suppress. Alexander's final years were marked by increasing mysticism and conservative reaction. The Holy Alliance, his attempt to govern Europe according to Christian principles, struck other leaders as the fantasy of a mind unhinged by power and guilt. His domestic policies grew increasingly repressive as he struggled to contain the liberal ideas his own victories had spread. The Tsar, who had once dreamed of constitutional monarchy, died in 1825, having reinforced autocracy more thoroughly than any of his predecessors. Yet Alexander's reign had transformed Russia's place in the world. No longer was the empire a peripheral power seeking European acceptance. Russia was now the continent's dominant military force, its Tsar the arbiter of European disputes. The Congress of Vienna, which redrew the map after Napoleon's defeat, was essentially a Russian peace imposed on a grateful but wary continent. Poland became a Russian satellite. Finland remained under Russian rule. The Eastern question, what to do about the declining Ottoman Empire, would be decided largely according to Russian interests. More subtly, the Napoleonic Wars had awakened something in the Russian soul. The empire that had once looked to Europe for cultural guidance now saw itself as Europe's saviour. The Third Rome ideology, dormant since Ivan III, stirred again. Russia was not merely another great power, but the guardian of Christian civilization, the bulwark against revolution, the empire with a special destiny. This messianic consciousness would shape Russian foreign policy for the next century and beyond. As Alexander lay dying in the Crimean city of Taganrog in 1825, Europe was already forgetting the magnitude of Russian sacrifice. The Congress system he had helped create was showing signs of strain. New revolutionary movements were stirring across the continent. At home, secret societies of officers and nobles were plotting to limit autocracy and perhaps end serfdom. The victory over Napoleon had made Russia a great power, but it had also planted seeds of discontent that would eventually grow into revolution. The empire stood at the height of its prestige and influence, yet beneath the surface, profound changes were stirring. The generation that had defeated Napoleon would not be content with the political system that had produced that victory. Russia had saved Europe from revolution, but it could not save itself from the consequences of its own success. The cannon shots that echoed across Senate Square on December 14, 1825, marked more than the end of a confused rebellion. They announced the birth of modern Russian autocracy, tempered in suspicion and hardened by fear. Nicholas III, who had never expected to rule, found himself emperor through the accident of his brother Constantine's secret renunciation of the throne. But the young guards officers who refused to swear allegiance to him that cold December morning gave Nicholas something more valuable than legitimacy. They gave him an enemy he could understand, and a purpose that would define his 30-year reign. The Decembrist revolt was a peculiarly Russian tragedy. Noble young men, educated in European ideas and battle-hardened in the wars against Napoleon, attempting to drag their homeland toward constitutional government through a coup that was doomed from its first confused moment. They had no clear plan, no unified leadership, no real understanding of the people they claimed to liberate. Standing in the freezing square, they shouted for Constantine and Constitution, while many of their soldiers believed Constitution was Constantine's wife. It was idealism of the most dangerous sort. Pure, passionate, and utterly divorced from reality. Nicholas, watching from the safety of the Winter Palace as his artillery prepared to fire on Russian nobles, learned lessons that would shape an empire. Revolution came not from the masses but from the educated elite. Ideas were weapons as dangerous as any cannon. The very officers who had saved Europe from Napoleon could become traitors to Russia's throne. Most dangerously, exposure to Western political thought was a poison that corrupted Russian souls and endangered Russian order. The subsequent investigation, conducted with methodical thoroughness, revealed to Nicholas the full extent of what he saw as intellectual corruption among Russia's elite. 5 Decembrists were hanged, the first executions of nobles in Russia for nearly a century. 120 others were sent to Siberian exile, their families stripped of rank and property. But more important than the punishments was the psychological effect. An entire generation of potential reformers was either eliminated or cowed into silence. From this trauma emerged the doctrine that would define Nicholas's reign: orthodoxy, autocracy, nationality. This trinity, formulated by his education minister Count Sergei Uvarov, was both a philosophy of government and a declaration of war against European liberalism. Orthodox Christianity would provide moral foundation, autocracy would ensure political stability, and Russian nationality would guard against foreign contamination. It was a coherent ideology for the first time in Russian history, and it was entirely defensive, designed not to transform Russia, but to preserve it against the winds of change blowing from the West. To enforce this ideology, Nicholas created the Third Section, arguably the most efficient secret police force of the 19th century. Under the direction of Count Alexander Benkendorf, this organization perfected surveillance as an art of government. The Third Section's pale blue uniforms became symbols of omnipresent authority. Its agents infiltrated universities, literary salons, even private dinner parties. No conversation was beyond suspicion, no gathering too small to warrant attention. Russians learned to speak carefully, to think twice before expressing opinions, to assume they were always being watched. Yet paradoxically, this repressive atmosphere produced Russia's greatest flowering of literature. Perhaps it was the very constraints that forced writers to develop the subtle art of saying dangerous things safely, of embedding revolutionary ideas in seemingly innocent narratives. Alexander Pushkin, Russia's first truly great poet, wrote The Bronze Horseman. Under Nicholas's censorship, a poem that seemed to celebrate Peter the Great, while actually questioning the cost of imperial ambition. Eugene Onegin, his novel in verse, captured the spiritual emptiness of an entire generation of educated Russians who had lost faith in their system but could see no alternative. Nikolai Gogol, that strange genius from Ukraine, used humour and fantasy to expose the corruption and absurdity of Russian bureaucracy. His play, The Inspector General, so perfectly satirised provincial officialdom that Nicholas himself laughed at its premiere, then reportedly said, "Everyone got it, and I most of all." Dead Souls, his novel about a man trading in the names of deceased serfs, revealed the moral bankruptcy of a system that treated human beings as property even after death. The censorship that produced this golden age was both more and less restrictive than it appeared. Writers learned to speak in parables, to hide revolutionary ideas behind historical allegories, to use humour as a weapon against authority. Readers, for their part, became extraordinarily sophisticated at decoding hidden meanings. A literature of winks and whispers developed, creating an intimacy between author and audience that more open societies rarely achieve. Nicholas himself embodied the contradictions of his system. 6 feet tall, magnificently uniformed, possessed of what contemporaries called an imperial presence, he looked every inch the autocrat. His daily routine was regulated like clockwork. He rose at 6, worked until late evening, and maintained a correspondence that ranged across every detail of imperial administration. He genuinely believed that Russia needed strong rule, that his subjects were children who required firm guidance, that autocracy was both his burden and Russia's salvation. Yet this same man who banned foreign travel for most Russians and censored their reading materials was deeply cultured himself. He spoke French fluently, German competently, and understood enough English to converse with British diplomats. He patronized the arts, expanded the Hermitage, and maintained a court that impressed foreign visitors with its sophistication. The Iron Tsar, as he came to be known, was neither ignorant nor brutal. He was a man who had convinced himself that freedom was Russia's enemy. The system Nicholas created was impressive in its thoroughness. The bureaucracy grew from 38,000 officials in 1800 to 114,000 by 1850. Every aspect of Russian life was regulated, classified, and controlled. Uniforms prescribed not just for government officials but for students, merchants, even coachmen, created a society where everyone's place was immediately visible. Travel required permits, publication required approval, even private correspondence was subject to inspection. This bureaucratic machine produced stability of a sort, but at the cost of stagnation. While Western Europe industrialized rapidly, Russia remained overwhelmingly agricultural. While constitutional governments developed across Europe, Russia perfected autocracy. While other nations built railways, Russia moved at the speed of horse and cart. The empire that had saved Europe from Napoleon was falling behind the very nations it had rescued. The reckoning came in the Crimea, where in 1854-1856, Russia faced a coalition of Britain, France, and Ottoman Turkey. What should have been a manageable conflict fought on Russia's own territory against enemies who had to supply their forces across vast distances became a humiliating defeat that exposed every weakness in Nicholas's system. Russian soldiers, brave as ever, charged British guns with medieval courage and died in medieval conditions. Russian supply lines, dependent on serf labour and primitive transport, collapsed under the strain of modern warfare. Russian commanders, selected for loyalty rather than competence, proved no match for enemies who had learned the lessons of professional military organisation. The siege of Sevastopol became a symbol of Russian endurance and Russian backwardness. For 11 months the garrison held out against superior forces, displaying the stoic courage that was Russia's greatest military asset. But courage could not compensate for rifles that fired one shot to the enemy's 5, for hospitals without proper medical supplies, for an administrative system so rigid that local commanders could not adapt to changing circumstances without permission from St. Petersburg. Most damaging was the revelation that Russia, despite its vast size and population, could not match the industrial capacity of much smaller Western nations. British factories produced more rifles than Russian armories. French telegraphs carried messages faster than Russian couriers. The empire that prided itself on strength was revealed to be fundamentally weak. Its apparent power based more on intimidation than actual capability. Nicholas II died on March 2, 1855, in the middle of the Crimean disaster, possibly from pneumonia, possibly from the psychological strain of watching his life's work crumble. His last words reportedly were, "I am dying, but Russia will not die." He had spent 30 years building a system designed to preserve Russia unchanged, and he died knowing it had failed. The Iron Tsar, who had bent his empire to his will, discovered too late that empires, like iron, can become so rigid they shatter under pressure. The world that died with Nicholas was more than a political system. It was an entire way of conceiving Russian identity. The notion that Russia could remain pure by isolation, that autocracy was strength rather than weakness, that change was always dangerous, these comfortable certainties lay buried in the Crimean mud. The new Tsar, Alexander II, inherited an empire that had learned through defeat what it could never learn through victory, that Russia must reform or perish. As we watch this old order die, we see the eternal pattern of imperial decline, not sudden collapse, but gradual recognition that the methods that once brought strength have become sources of weakness. The very qualities that had made Russia great under Catherine and Alexander VI, centralized authority, military valor, patient endurance, had become obstacles to greatness in an age of rapid change. The empire stood at another threshold, facing once again the choice between transformation and death. Alexander Nikolaevich ascended to the throne of a defeated empire on March 2, 1855, inheriting not just a crown but a catastrophe. The Crimean War had exposed every weakness of his father's system, the corruption, the technological backwardness, the fundamental hollowness of Russian strength. As the new Tsar surveyed his realm, he saw clearly what Nicholas III had refused to acknowledge. Russia must change or die. What he could not foresee was that the very reforms that would earn him the title Liberator would also sign his death warrant. The young emperor was 36 years old, thoughtful, well-educated, and possessed of a genuine desire to serve his people. Unlike his father, who had viewed change as betrayal of a Russian tradition, Alexander understood that tradition itself would perish unless it adapted to modern realities. His famous declaration that it is better to abolish serfdom from above than to wait until it begins to abolish itself from below captured both his pragmatic wisdom and his tragic limitation. He sought to control the very forces his reforms would unleash. The magnitude of what Alexander contemplated can barely be comprehended today. In 1861, Russia contained approximately 23 million privately owned serfs human beings who could be bought, sold, mortgaged, or gambled away like cattle. Add to this the 25 million state peasants living in conditions barely different from slavery, and nearly half of Russia's population existed in some form of bondage. No nation in modern European history had attempted to transform so fundamentally the basis of its social order while maintaining political stability. The process of emancipation consumed 5 years of careful preparation. Committees of nobles, bureaucrats, and experts worked through thousands of details. How much land should freed serfs receive? How would they pay for it? What obligations would they owe to their former masters? How would local government function without the serf-owning nobility as administrators? Each question opened into dozens of others, and every answer affected millions of lives. The Emancipation Manifesto, signed on March 3, 1861, the 6th anniversary of Alexander's accession, was proclaimed from church pulpits across the empire. The peasants attached to the soil will be invested within a determined period with all the rights of free rural inhabitants, the manifesto declared. After centuries of bondage, Russian peasants were legally free. Yet like so many of Alexander's reforms, emancipation was both revolutionary and conservative, generous and grudging, transformative and incomplete. The freed serfs received not just personal liberty, but land roughly half of what they had cultivated as serfs. However, they had to pay for this land through redemption payments spread over 49 years. The irony was bitter. Freedom came with debt, liberation with new forms of obligation. Moreover, the land was granted not to individuals but to village communes, which meant that collective responsibility replaced individual bondage. Many peasants, understanding this, reportedly wept when they heard the terms of their liberation. But Alexander's vision extended far beyond serf emancipation. The great reforms of the 1860s and 1870s touched every aspect of Russian life. Judicial reform created independent courts with trial by jury revolutionary concepts in an empire where justice had always been the Tsar's personal prerogative. Local government reform established zemstvos, elected councils that brought a measure of self-administration to Russian provinces. Military reform abolished the brutal system of 25-year service and created a modern army based on universal conscription and professional training. Educational reforms expanded access to learning across social classes. Censorship, while not eliminated, was relaxed enough to permit serious discussion of social issues. University curricula were modernized and expanded. Women were allowed to attend university lectures, and primary education was extended to both sexes. For the first time in Russian history, it seemed possible that the empire might evolve into something resembling a constitutional monarchy. Yet every reform created new problems, and every solution generated unexpected consequences. The peasants, legally free but economically trapped, often found their condition worse than before emancipation. The nobles, compensated for their lost serfs but deprived of their traditional role as local administrators, felt betrayed by the very reforms that enriched them. The new middle class, empowered by educational and economic opportunities, demanded political rights that Alexander was unwilling to grant. Most dangerously, the reforms awakened expectations they could not fulfill. If serfs could be freed, why not all of Russian society from autocracy? If trial by jury was good for criminals, why not constitutional government for citizens? Alexander had hoped to modernize Russia while preserving autocracy. But modernization created forces that would not be contained within traditional structures. The Polish uprising of 1863 revealed the limits of Alexander's liberalism and the persistence of imperial instincts beneath reformist rhetoric. When Polish nobles attempted to restore their nation's independence, Alexander's response was swift and brutal. The rebellion was crushed with systematic thoroughness. Polish estates were confiscated and given to Russian peasants. The Polish language was banned from schools and government offices. Catholic churches were closed or converted to Orthodox use. The Kingdom of Poland ceased to exist except in name, becoming simply the Vistula provinces of the Russian Empire. This suppression demonstrated that Alexander's reforms had boundaries. They were designed to strengthen the empire, not dismember it. The peasants might be freed, but subject peoples would not be. Society might be modernized, but imperial unity was non-negotiable. This contradiction between liberalism at home and repression in the borderlands would plague every subsequent Russian ruler. The violence in Poland also catalyzed the emergence of Russia's first modern revolutionary movement. Young intellectuals, mostly from noble families, horrified by the brutality of Polish suppression and frustrated by the limitations of legal reform, began to advocate more radical solutions. The Narodniki, or Going to the People movement, saw salvation in Russia's peasant communes, which they romantically viewed as seeds of socialist transformation. These idealistic young people abandoned comfortable lives to live among peasants, hoping to educate them toward revolution. The peasants, however, proved stubbornly unreceptive to revolutionary propaganda. Instead of welcoming their would-be liberators, they often turned Narodniki over to police as suspicious outsiders. The failure of peaceful persuasion led some revolutionaries toward more violent tactics. The Nihilists, as they came to be known, rejected all traditional values and embraced terrorism as both tactic and philosophy. For them, destruction was creative only by tearing down the existing order could a just society be built. Alexander became the primary target of this terrorist campaign. The first attempt on his life came in 1866, when Dmitry Karakozov fired a pistol at the Tsar as he left the summer garden in St. Petersburg. The shot missed, but it marked the beginning of a cat-and-mouse game that would continue for 15 years. Revolutionary organizations like People's Will dedicated themselves to regicide with religious fervor, while the Third Section and its successors developed increasingly sophisticated counterintelligence techniques. The assassination attempts multiplied and grew more elaborate. Revolutionaries tried to blow up the Tsar's train, placed explosives in the Winter Palace dining room, and planned ambushes during his daily walks. Each failed attempt only strengthened their determination and refined their methods. Alexander, to his credit, refused to become a prisoner in his own palace. He continued his public appearances, maintained his daily routines, and pushed forward with reforms even as he knew that somewhere in the shadows, young men and women were planning his death. The final irony of Alexander's reign came on March 1st, 1881. That morning, he had signed approval for the Loris Melikov Constitution, a modest proposal that would have established consultative assemblies and moved Russia toward constitutional monarchy. It was the culmination of 26 years of gradual reform, the logical next step in transforming Russia into a modern state governed by law. Had it been implemented, Russian history might have taken a dramatically different path. Instead, as Alexander's carriage travelled along the Catherine Canal in St. Petersburg that afternoon, Ignacy Hrunevsky threw a bomb that killed both the liberator and his assassin. The Tsar, who had freed the serfs, reformed the courts, modernized the military, and was preparing to limit his own power, died in the snow, his blood mingling with that of the young revolutionary who had murdered him. The tragedy of Alexander II lay not in his failures, but in his success. His reforms had awakened Russian society from centuries of slumber, but awakening brought not gratitude but demands for more. He had tried to navigate between the extremes of reaction and revolution, satisfying neither conservatives who wanted no change nor radicals who wanted total transformation. Like so many reformers in history, he discovered that the middle ground is often the most dangerous place to stand. As his son Alexander III prepared to inherit the throne, the empire faced a choice between continuing the path of gradual reform or returning to the harsh certainties of autocracy. The blood on the Catherine Canal seemed to argue for reaction, but the forces unleashed by 26 years of reform could not be easily contained. The liberator was dead, but liberation in all its chaotic, uncontrollable forms had only just begun. The giant who inherited the throne on that blood-stained March evening in 1881 was everything his father had not been: physically massive, intellectually conservative, emotionally certain that Russia's salvation lay not in accommodation with modernity, but in rejection of it. Alexander III stood 6 feet 4 inches tall, possessed the strength to bend horseshoes with his bare hands, and harboured the unshakable conviction that his father's murder proved the bankruptcy of reform. Where Alexander II had been thoughtful, Alexander I was instinctive. Where the liberator had sought to modernize autocracy, the peacemaker, as he would become known, sought to restore it to its primitive purity. The new emperor's first act was to tear up the Loris Melikov constitution that had cost his father his life. There would be no constitutional monarchy, no elected assemblies, no further erosion of autocratic power. Instead, Alexander III embarked on what historians would call the counter-reforms, a systematic effort to undo the liberal experiments of the previous reign and return Russia to the certainties of an earlier age. It was a policy born of grief, shaped by fear, and destined to create the very pressures it sought to contain. The theory behind Alexander III's reign was deceptively simple. Diversity was weakness, uniformity was strength. The empire that stretched from the Baltic to the Pacific, encompassing dozens of ethnic groups and several major religions, would be made truly Russian through the systematic policy known as Russification. One Tsar, one faith, one language became the unofficial motto of the new administration. What this meant in practice was the suppression of local cultures, the privileging of Orthodox Christianity over other faiths, and the imposition of Russian language and customs on populations that had maintained their distinct identities for centuries. In Poland, still smarting from the failed rebellion of 1863, Russification took particularly harsh forms. Polish language was banned from schools and government offices. Polish history was rewritten to emphasize Russian contributions and minimize Polish achievements. The University of Warsaw was closed and replaced by a Russian institution. Even private conversations in Polish were discouraged, and children were encouraged to inform on parents who spoke their native language at home. The goal was not merely political control, but cultural extinction, the transformation of Poles into Russians through systematic suppression of Polish identity. Similar policies were implemented across the empire's borderlands. In the Baltic provinces, German nobles who had served Russian Tsars for 2 centuries found their privileges curtailed and their language marginalized. Finnish autonomy, granted by Alexander the Rey and respected by his successors, came under increasing pressure. Ukrainian culture, dismissed as merely a dialect of Russian, was subjected to systematic suppression. The very diversity that had been one of the empire's sources of strength was now seen as a disease to be cured through administrative medicine. The policy toward Russia's 5 million Jews was particularly savage. Alexander III, convinced that Jewish influence had corrupted Russian society and contributed to his father's assassination, unleashed a wave of official and unofficial persecution that would drive millions to emigrate and radicalize those who remained. The Pale of Settlement, that vast ghetto encompassing much of modern-day Poland, Lithuania, Belarus and Ukraine, became a prison where Jews were confined by law. Within this area, new restrictions multiplied. Jews were banned from rural areas, limited in their access to education, excluded from most professions, and subjected to discriminatory taxation. The pogroms that swept through the Pale in 1881-1882 reveal the deadly consequences of official anti-Semitism. When mobs attacked Jewish communities in Kiev, Odessa, and hundreds of smaller towns, local authorities either stood aside or actively encouraged the violence. Synagogues were burned, businesses looted, families murdered or driven from their homes. The government's response was not to punish the perpetrators but to blame the victims. Jews were accused of exploiting Christians and bringing persecution upon themselves. The result was the greatest voluntary migration in modern Jewish history. Between 1881 and 1914, approximately 2 million Jews would leave the Russian Empire, most bound for America. Those who remained often turned to revolutionary movements, finding in socialism and anarchism the hope for a world where ethnicity and religion would not determine one's fate. The policy designed to strengthen Russian unity by eliminating Jewish influence instead created a massive emigration that strengthened America while weakening Russia and radicalized those who stayed behind. Yet Alexander III's reign was not merely about repression, it was also about the massive infrastructure project that would transform the empire more profoundly than any political reform. The Trans-Siberian Railway, begun in 1891, was the longest railroad construction project in human history, spanning 5,372 miles from Moscow to Vladivostok. More than a transportation system, it was a symbol of Russian determination to bind the vast empire together with ribbons of steel. The engineering challenges were staggering. The railway had to cross 7 time zones, navigate around Lake Baikal, tunnel through mountain ranges, and bridge rivers that turned to ice in winter and flooding torrents in spring. The human cost was equally daunting. Workers died by the thousands from disease, accidents, and the brutal conditions of Siberian construction sites. Entire cities sprang up along the route, populated by engineers, workers, merchants, and adventurers, drawn by the promise of wages and the romance of building something unprecedented. The railway's strategic importance was immediately apparent. Russian troops could now be moved from Moscow to the Pacific in weeks rather than months. Siberian resources, timber, minerals, furs, could reach European markets efficiently for the first time. Most importantly, the railway opened Siberia to systematic Russian settlement. Millions of peasants, seeking land and opportunity, migrated eastward along the railroad, transforming the demographic balance of northern Asia. By 1914, Siberia contained 6 million Russian settlers, a human tide that had flowed along the steel pathway Alexander III had commissioned. Industrialization, barely begun under previous reigns, accelerated dramatically during Alexander's reign. Foreign investment, particularly from France, poured into Russian factories and mines. The textile industry, centered in Moscow, began competing with British manufacturers in Asian markets. Oil production around Baku made Russia one of the world's leading petroleum producers. Coal mining in the Donets Basin fueled new iron and steel plants. By 1894, Russia was producing more pig iron than France and rapidly closing the gap with Germany. This industrial revolution created new social classes and new sources of tension. Factory workers, crowded into urban slums and subjected to industrial discipline their fathers had never known, began organizing strikes and joining revolutionary movements. Industrial capitalists, dependent on government contracts but frustrated by bureaucratic interference, demanded greater political influence. The middle class, expanded by industrial growth, sought the civil liberties and constitutional government that their counterparts in Western Europe took for granted. Alexander III's solution to these growing pressures was characteristically simple. More police, more censorship, more administrative control. The Okhrana, the secret police organization that replaced the third section, became one of the most sophisticated intelligence services in the world. Its agents infiltrated revolutionary organizations so thoroughly that by some estimates, 1 in 4 revolutionary leaders was actually a police informant. The agency pioneered techniques of surveillance, provocation, and counterintelligence that would later be adopted by secret services worldwide. Yet for all his repressive measures, Alexander III presided over what was, paradoxically, the most peaceful period in modern Russian history. No major wars troubled his reign. The empire's borders remained stable. Revolutionary movements, while persistent, never seriously threatened the government's control. The economy grew steadily, if not spectacularly. Population increased from 98 million in 1881 to 117 million in 1894. For the first time since the Napoleonic era, Russians could feel that their country was both strong and secure. This stability was achieved, however, at the cost of addressing fundamental problems that continued to fester beneath the surface. The peasantry, still bound to their villages by redemption payments and communal obligations, remained desperately poor. The educated classes, denied political outlets for their aspirations, turned increasingly toward revolutionary solutions. The empire's ethnic minorities, subjected to systematic cultural suppression, harboured grievances that would eventually explode into violence. Most ominously, the autocratic system that Alexander III had strengthened so carefully depended entirely on the personal capacity of the autocrat, and his successor would prove tragically unequal to the burden he inherited. Alexander III died suddenly of kidney disease on November 1, 1894, at the age of 49. His death came as a shock to a nation that had grown accustomed to his reassuring presence. The giant who could bend horseshoes had seemed indestructible, a permanent fixture in an age of rapid change. His funeral procession through St. Petersburg drew massive crowds who understood, perhaps better than the government itself, that an era was ending. The empire Alexander III left to his son was superficially stronger than it had ever been, larger, richer, more industrialized, more militarily powerful. The Trans-Siberian Railway stretched across continents. Russian factories produced goods that competed in world markets. The Okhrana had revolutionary movements under seemingly complete control. Yet beneath this impressive surface, all the contradictions that Alexander had suppressed rather than resolved continued to grow. The pressure was building in the great autocratic machine, and his son Nicholas would inherit not just a crown but a time bomb whose fuse was already burning. On the morning of November 1st, 1894, as his father Alexander III lay dying at the Livadia Palace in the Crimea, the 26-year-old Nicholas Alexandrovich wrote in his diary words that would prove heartbreakingly prophetic. "I am not prepared to be Tsar. I never wanted to become one. I know nothing of the business of ruling. Within hours he would be emperor of the largest empire on earth, inheritor of an autocratic tradition stretching back to Ivan the Terrible, master of 130 million subjects scattered across 11 time zones. Yet this reluctant sovereign, whose greatest desire was to live quietly with his beloved family, would preside over the final tragic act of the imperial drama his ancestors had written in blood and glory. Nicholas possessed many admirable qualities. He was devoted to his wife and children, personally honest, capable of great kindness, and deeply religious. What he lacked was the iron will that had sustained Russian autocracy through 3 centuries of crisis. Where his father had been granite, Nicholas was quicksilver changeable, indecisive, prone to falling under the influence of the last strong personality he had encountered. In an age when Russia needed either dramatic reform or ruthless repression, Nicholas would attempt both and succeed at neither. His marriage to Alexandra Feodorovna, born Princess Alex of Hesse-Darmstadt, brought him personal happiness but political disaster. Alexandra was beautiful, intelligent, and utterly devoted to her husband and children. She was also German in an age of rising nationalism, painfully shy in a position requiring constant public performance, and convinced that any compromise with constitutional government would doom the dynasty. Her influence over Nicholas grew stronger with each passing year, and her advice grew more dangerously reactionary as the empire's problems multiplied. The shadow that would ultimately destroy both their happiness and their empire was cast by a secret known only to the immediate royal family. Their only son and heir, Alexei, suffered from haemophilia. This hereditary bleeding disorder, passed down through Queen Victoria's descendants, meant that any injury could prove fatal to the future emperor. The boy's condition was kept from the Russian people, but its psychological impact on his parents was devastating. Alexandra, racked with guilt for transmitting the disease and terrified of losing her son, became increasingly religious and increasingly isolated from Russian society. Into this atmosphere of secrecy and desperation came Grigory Rasputin, a Siberian peasant who claimed miraculous healing powers. Whether through hypnosis, folk medicine, or sheer coincidence, Rasputin did seem able to help Alexei during his worst haemophilic crises. This apparent power over life and death gave the unsavoury Starets holy man enormous influence over the Empress, and through her, over policy decisions that affected the entire empire. Rasputin's presence at court became a scandal that undermined the monarchy's moral authority at the very moment when it most needed popular support. The first great crisis of Nicholas's reign came with the Revolution of 1905, sparked by an event that came to be known as Bloody Sunday. On January 9th, thousands of workers led by the priest Father Gapon marched peacefully to the Winter Palace, carrying icons and portraits of the Tsar, seeking to petition their little father for better working conditions and relief from economic hardship. They believed in the ancient Russian myth of the good Tsar misled by evil advisers, and they came seeking justice from their emperor. Instead, they found bullets. Palace guards, unprepared for such a massive demonstration and lacking clear orders, opened fire on the unarmed crowd. Hundreds were killed or wounded in the snow outside the palace, where Peter the Great had once dreamed of making Russia European. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the physical casualties. In a single afternoon, the bond between Tsar and people, that mystical connection, which had sustained Russian autocracy through centuries of suffering, was shattered forever. Revolutions spread across the empire like wildfire. Peasants seized landlords' estates. Workers organized strikes that paralyzed major cities. Soldiers and sailors mutinied against their officers. Ethnic minorities rose in revolt against Russification. For a terrifying moment it seemed as though the empire might simply dissolve into chaos, as the time of troubles had nearly dissolved it 3 centuries earlier. Nicholas's response was characteristic. After months of indecision, he issued the October Manifesto promising constitutional government, civil liberties, and an elected parliament. It was too little for revolutionaries, who wanted the complete overthrow of the old order, and too much for conservatives who saw any limit on autocracy as the beginning of the end. Most tragically, Nicholas himself never fully accepted the constitutional system he had proclaimed. He viewed the Duma, the new parliament, as an unfortunate necessity rather than a legitimate partner in governance. The man who might have made this constitutional experiment work was Pyotr Stolypin, appointed Prime Minister in 1906. Stolypin understood that Russia needed fundamental social and economic reform to survive in the modern world, but that such reform must come gradually and with respect for legitimate authority. His agricultural reforms, designed to break up the peasant communes and create a class of independent farmers, showed promise of transforming Russian society from the bottom up. "Give me 20 years of peace," Stolypin reportedly said, "and I will transform Russia." He was given 5. In 1911, Stolypin was assassinated while attending a gala performance at the Kiev Opera House, shot by a revolutionary who was also, incredibly, a police informer. With Stolypin's death, Russia lost its last chance for peaceful evolution toward constitutional monarchy. Nicholas, relieved to be free of a minister whose intelligence and strength had often made him feel inadequate, returned to the comfortable certainties of personal rule. The final act of the imperial tragedy began in August 1914, when Russia entered the Great War in support of Serbia and against Germany and Austria-Hungary. The decision was popular. Crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace to sing the national anthem and cheer their emperor. After a decade of revolutionary turmoil, war seemed to offer national unity and purpose. Russia's vast armies would surely crush the German forces. The war would be over by Christmas, and the empire would emerge stronger and more unified than ever. Instead, the war became a catastrophe that dwarfed even the Crimean defeat. Russian soldiers, brave as always, charged German machine guns with a courage that amazed their enemies. But courage could not compensate for inadequate weapons, incompetent leadership, and supply systems that collapsed under the strain of modern warfare. By 1915, Russian factories were producing 1,000 artillery shells per day, while the army was firing 45,000. Soldiers went into battle without rifles, waiting for their comrades to be killed so they could pick up weapons from the dead. The home front fared no better. Military conscription removed millions of peasants from agricultural production. The railway system, strained by military transport, could not deliver food to the cities. Inflation soared as the government printed money to pay for the war. By 1916, bread lines stretched through the streets of St. Petersburg, and factory workers spoke openly of revolution. Nicholas's decision in 1915 to assume personal command of the armies was intended to rally the troops and demonstrate his commitment to victory. Instead, it made him personally responsible for every military disaster. Moreover, his absence from the capital left the government in the hands of Alexandra and her council of ministers incompetent men, chosen more for their loyalty to Rasputin than their administrative ability. Russians began to whisper that the German-born empress was a traitor, that Rasputin was a German spy, that the royal family had betrayed Russia to its enemies. The murder of Rasputin in December 1916 by a group of nobles led by Prince Felix Yusupov was intended to save the monarchy by removing its most discrediting influence. Instead, it demonstrated how completely the royal family had lost the support of even its traditional allies. When the Starets was found dead in the Neva River, reportedly after being poisoned, shot and beaten, Alexandra mourned him as a holy martyr while most Russians celebrated his death as overdue justice. By February 1917, the empire was balanced on the edge of collapse. Military defeats had cost 4 million casualties. The economy had virtually ceased to function. The transportation system was breaking down. Most dangerously, the army, the monarchy's ultimate guarantee, was losing faith in its commanders and its cause. When strikes and demonstrations began in Petrograd on International Women's Day, March 8th, February 23rd in the old Russian calendar, few observers expected them to be different from dozens of previous protests. But this time was different. When ordered to fire on demonstrators, soldiers began joining them instead. Within days, the entire Petrograd garrison had gone over to the revolution. Nicholas, isolated at military headquarters, received telegrams from his remaining supporters, advising him that only abdication could save the dynasty. On March 2nd, 1917, in a railway car near Pskov, the last Tsar of Russia signed away 3 centuries of Romanov rule with a few strokes of his pen. The man who had never wanted to be emperor expressed relief at laying down his burden. "I slept deeply and long," he wrote in his diary after abdicating. "My head is clear. It is as if a weight has been lifted from me." He asked only to retire quietly with his family to their estate in the Crimea, to live the private life he had always desired. Instead, the provisional government, fearing he might become a rallying point for counter-revolution, kept him under house arrest. As we watch the last emperor of Russia fade into captivity, we see the end of more than a dynasty. We see the death of an idea that had shaped Russian consciousness since the fall of Byzantium. The notion that Russia was special, that it required autocratic government, that the Tsar was God's anointed, these beliefs, which had sustained the empire through centuries of expansion and crisis, could not survive the catastrophe of modern war fought with medieval methods. Nicholas II was not evil, merely inadequate. He was a good man who happened to be a bad emperor, gentle soul trapped in a role that demanded strength, loving father burdened with responsibilities that crushed his spirit. His tragedy was also Russia's tragedy, the mismatch between the demands of modernity and the inheritance of autocracy, between the needs of a complex society and the limitations of personal rule. The empire that had begun with Viking traders on Russian rivers was ending in a railway car near a provincial town, not with conquest or glory, but with a weary man's signature on a document of abdication. The Third Rome had fallen, and this time there would be no fourth. In the gathering darkness of revolution, the old order was dying, and no one could predict what would rise from its ashes. The summer of 1914 shimmered with a deceptive promise of peace. European courts glittered with royal weddings and diplomatic receptions. The great powers had avoided major war for nearly a century, settling their differences through conferences and compromise. Yet beneath this civilized surface, alliances and ambitions had created a web of obligations so complex that a single spark could ignite a continental conflagration. That spark came in Sarajevo on June 28th, when a Serbian nationalist bullet killed Archduke Franz Ferdinand and lit the fuse that would destroy 4 empires and 20 million lives. For Russia, the crisis presented both opportunity and obligation. As protector of the Slavs and guardian of Orthodox Christianity, the empire could not abandon Serbia to Austrian vengeance. When Austria-Hungary declared war on Serbia, Russia faced the moment every great power dreads, when treaty obligations demand sacrifice of blood and treasure for abstract principles of honour and alliance. Nicholas II, who had spent his reign avoiding decisive action, found himself forced to choose between betraying Russia's Slavic brothers or facing war with Germany and Austria simultaneously. The mobilization that began on July 30th, 1914, unleashed emotions that surprised everyone with their intensity. In St. Petersburg, crowds gathered outside the Winter Palace singing patriotic hymns and shouting loyalty to their Tsar. The city itself was hastily renamed Petrograd to sound less German. Workers who had been striking weeks earlier now volunteered eagerly for military service. Students abandoned their studies to join reserve units. Even revolutionaries proclaimed their support for the war effort. It seemed as though the national unity that had eluded Nicholas through a decade of crisis had finally emerged in the face of foreign threat. This patriotic euphoria carried Russian armies into East Prussia and Galicia with confidence bordering on arrogance. Russian generals, remembering their grandfather's march to Paris in 1814, spoke confidently of reaching Berlin before Christmas. The steamroller, as foreign newspapers called the Russian army, would crush German resistance through sheer weight of numbers. With 1.4 million men under arms and millions more ready to be conscripted, Russia possessed what seemed like an inexhaustible supply of soldiers. The first collision with reality came at Tannenberg in late August 1914. General Samsonov's Second Army, advancing into East Prussia with insufficient coordination and communication, walked into a trap expertly prepared by German generals Hindenburg and Ludendorff. The battle that followed was less a defeat than an annihilation. In 4 days of fighting, the Russians lost 50,000 casualties and 90,000 prisoners. Samsonov himself, overwhelmed by the magnitude of disaster, wandered into a forest and shot himself. An entire army had simply ceased to exist. The Masurian Lakes disaster that followed completed the destruction of Russian forces in East Prussia. Within 6 weeks of the war's beginning, Russia had lost its 2 best-equipped armies and most of its professional officer corps. The psychological impact was even more devastating than the material losses. Russian soldiers, who had marched to war singing of easy victory, discovered that German artillery was more accurate, German machine guns more deadly, and German organisation more efficient than anything their commanders had prepared them to face. Yet the army's greatest enemy proved to be not German efficiency but Russian incompetence. The supply system, barely adequate in peacetime, collapsed under the strain of modern warfare. Artillery units fired their allotted shells in days rather than months, then stood helpless as German bombardments pulverized their positions. Soldiers went into battle without adequate weapons, some carrying clubs or sharpened stakes instead of rifles. Medical services, overwhelmed by casualty rates that exceeded every prediction, left wounded men to die in field hospitals that lacked basic supplies. The Great Retreat of 1915 became a catastrophe that dwarfed even the disasters of the previous year. German and Austrian forces, reinforced from the Western Front, smashed through Russian lines in a coordinated offensive that recaptured all of Poland and penetrated deep into Russian territory. Entire cities were evacuated, their population streaming eastward in massive refugee columns. The army that retreated was barely recognizable as the force that had marched to war with such confidence the year before. Units had lost their weapons, their organization, and increasingly their will to fight. It was at this nadir of Russian fortunes that Nicholas made perhaps the most fateful decision of his reign. He dismissed the Grand Duke Nicholas as commander-in-chief and assumed personal command of the armies. The decision was meant to rally the troops and demonstrate imperial commitment to victory. Instead, it made Nicholas personally responsible for every future defeat, while removing him from the capital at the moment when political leadership was most needed. The emperor who departed for military headquarters at Mogilev in September 1915 left behind a government in chaos and a capital seething with discontent. Alexandra, guided by Rasputin's mystical advice, began dismissing ministers and appointing favourites with bewildering frequency. In the space of 2 years, Russia had 4 different prime ministers, 5 interior ministers, 3 foreign ministers, and 4 defence ministers. Each change brought new policies and fresh confusion, creating an impression of governmental breakdown that eroded what remained of public confidence. On the home front, the war's impact grew more devastating with each passing month. Industrial production, mobilized for military needs, could no longer supply civilian requirements. Food supplies, disrupted by military conscription and transportation chaos, became critically short in major cities. Inflation, fueled by government borrowing and currency printing, destroyed the savings of the middle class and pushed workers towards starvation wages. The breadlines that appeared in Petrograd during the winter of 1916-1917 became symbols of the old regime's failure. Women who had sent their husbands and sons to war now stood for hours in freezing temperatures, hoping to buy bread that often ran out before they reached the front of the line. Factory workers, earning wages that bought less each week, organised strikes that the government lacked the force to suppress. Even the weather seemed to conspire against the monarchy. The winter of 1916-1917 was one of the coldest on record, making food shortages more acute and popular, suffering more intense. Most ominously, the army itself was losing faith in its cause and commanders. Desertion rates soared as peasant soldiers received letters from home describing starvation and hardship. Officers who had led men with confidence in 1914 now feared mutiny in their own ranks. Military intelligence reports, reaching the Tsar through layers of censorship and wishful thinking, painted an increasingly desperate picture of an army that was physically present but spiritually defeated. The revolution, when it came in February 1917, surprised everyone with its spontaneity and speed. There was no coordinated revolutionary conspiracy, no organised plot to overthrow the monarchy. Instead, the accumulated grievances of 3 years of disastrous war reached a critical mass that no government could contain. It began with women protesting bread shortages on International Women's Day, March 8th, February 23rd in the old Russian calendar, and within a week had toppled a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. As we watch the great wheel of Russian history turn toward its final revolution, we see the tragedy of a system that had outlived its usefulness. The autocracy that had built an empire and saved Europe from Napoleon proved incapable of managing the complex demands of industrial warfare. The Tsar, who wanted only to live quietly with his family, found himself commanding armies he could not control in a war he did not understand. The empire that had seemed so solid in 1913 was revealed to be a house of cards, held together only by habit and fear, ready to collapse at the first strong wind. February 1917 would bring that wind, and with it, the end of everything the Romanovs had built and believed. The morning of March 8, 1917, dawned grey and bitter over Petrograd, with temperatures well below freezing and snow covering the broad boulevards where emperors had once paraded in triumph. International Women's Day had been observed quietly in previous years, but this year felt different. The women who gathered in the factory districts were not carrying banners demanding political rights, they were demanding bread. 3 years of war had reduced the capital of a great empire to a city where mothers could not feed their children, where workers spent more time searching for food than producing goods, where the very word bread had become a revolutionary slogan. The demonstrations that began in the Vyborg district seemed no different from dozens of others that had flickered and died during the war years. Women from the textile mills, joined by metal workers from the great Putilov plant, marched through the industrial neighbourhoods chanting bread, bread. Police officials watching from their stations noted the crowds with routine concern. Revolutionary agitators had called such demonstrations many times before. The authorities possessed ample force to suppress them. 2,000 police, several companies of Cossacks, and the entire Petrograd garrison of 150,000 men. But something had changed in the chemistry of popular discontent. When police moved to arrest demonstration leaders, crowds protected them. When Cossacks were ordered to charge protesters, they rode slowly, deliberately avoiding contact. Most tellingly, when government officials ordered bread shops to close to prevent looting, the action only inflamed popular anger. By evening, what had begun as scattered protests had grown into a general strike, involving more than 100,000 workers across the city. The second day brought a crucial escalation. Students from the universities joined the workers, bringing education and organisation to what had been spontaneous anger. The crowd swelled to nearly 200,000, flowing from the factory districts into the centre of the city. They crossed the bridges over the frozen Neva that connected working-class neighbourhoods to the elegant heart of imperial power. For the first time, revolutionary songs echoed in the shadow of the Winter Palace itself. The government's response revealed its fatal weakness. It possessed overwhelming force, but lacked the will to use it decisively. General Khabalov, commander of the Petrograd garrison, had clear orders from the Tsar to restore order, but his troops were reluctant to fire on crowds that included their own wives and sisters. The Cossacks, traditional pillars of autocracy, seemed particularly unreliable. When ordered to clear Nevsky Prospect, they dispersed the crowds without violence, some even sharing jokes with protesters. The revolution's decisive moment came on the third day, when military discipline finally collapsed. The Pavlovsky Regiment, ordered to fire on demonstrators, instead turned their rifles on the police. Word of the mutiny spread through the garrison like wildfire. Regiment after regiment joined the revolution, bringing with them not just weapons but the symbolic authority of the Tsar's own forces. By evening, revolutionary crowds controlled most of the city centre, and the government controlled little more than the Winter Palace and a few police stations. What made this revolution different from 1905 was the completeness of the military collapse. In the earlier revolution, the army had remained loyal, eventually suppressing the uprising through martial law and mass arrests. But the soldiers of 1917 were not the professionals of 1905, they were conscripted peasants, who had seen their officers lead them to slaughter in Poland and East Prussia. They had received letters from home describing starvation and hardship. They understood that the war was lost and the government responsible was theirs to overthrow. The speed of the collapse amazed everyone, including the revolutionaries themselves. Political leaders who had spent years in exile or prison suddenly found themselves trying to create a government from the chaos. Two competing centres of power emerged almost simultaneously. The Provisional Government, formed by liberal members of the old Duma, and the Soviet of Workers' and Soldiers' Deputies, elected by the factories and military units. This dual power arrangement reflected the revolution's fundamental contradiction. The liberals who claimed legal authority lacked popular support, while the radicals who commanded popular loyalty lacked governmental experience. Nicholas II, isolated at military headquarters 800 kilometers from the capital, learned of the revolution through fragmentary telegrams that failed to convey its scope or intensity. His initial response was characteristic. He ordered military units to suppress the disturbances and began travelling back to Petrograd to take personal control. But the railway workers who controlled his route had joined the revolution, and his imperial train found itself shunted onto sidings, its destination no longer the capital, but whatever provincial station would accept an unwanted passenger. The abdication, when it finally came, was almost anticlimactic. At Scoff Station on March 2nd, 1917, Nicholas met with representatives of the provisional government, who informed him that his only choice was between abdication and civil war. The generals who had once competed for imperial favour now united in advising him to step down. Even the army's high command, that final bastion of monarchist loyalty, had concluded that the Tsar had become an obstacle to Russia's survival. The document Nicholas signed in his railway car was brief and matter-of-fact, lacking the dramatic flourishes one might expect from the end of a dynasty that had ruled for 3 centuries. In the days of the great struggle against the external enemy, who for nearly 3 years has been trying to enslave our fatherland, it read, the Lord God has been pleased to send down on Russia a new heavy trial. He abdicated not just for himself but for his son, passing the crown to his brother Michael, who promptly refused it, leaving Russia without an emperor for the first time since 1613. The news of abdication reached Petrograd on March 3rd, touching off celebrations that revealed the depth of popular alienation from the monarchy. Crowds cheered, soldiers tore the imperial eagles from their caps, and revolutionary orators proclaimed the dawn of a new age. The Romanov double-headed eagle, which had watched over Russian destiny since Ivan III, was torn down from government buildings and replaced with red flags. 300 years of autocracy ended not with a bang but with a whimper, a tired man's signature on a piece of paper in a provincial railway car. Yet the revolution that destroyed autocracy created as many problems as it solved. The provisional government, led by liberals like Prince Lvov and later Alexander Kerensky, inherited not just power but chaos. The army was disintegrating, the economy was collapsing, and the war was still raging. Most dangerously, the February Revolution had unleashed expectations it could not fulfill. Workers expected immediate improvements in wages and conditions. Peasants expected immediate distribution of land. Soldiers expected immediate peace. The government that promised to satisfy these demands while continuing the war and maintaining constitutional order faced an impossible task. The Soviet, controlled by socialist intellectuals but representing workers and soldiers, possessed what the government lacked, popular legitimacy. When the Soviet issued Order No. 1, granting soldiers the right to elect their officers and ignore commands they considered counter-revolutionary, it effectively destroyed what remained of military discipline. When it called for workers' control in factories, it undermined industrial production. The Soviet claimed it was not seeking power, merely ensuring that the revolution's gains were protected. In practice, it was creating a parallel government that commanded greater loyalty than the official one. Perhaps most ominously, the February Revolution had solved none of the fundamental problems that had caused it. Russia was still at war, still economically devastated, still socially divided. The breadlines that had sparked the revolution still snaked through Petrograd streets. The soldiers who had overthrown the Tsar still faced German artillery at the front. The peasants who celebrated the monarchy's fall still worked land they did not own. The revolution had removed the symbol of oppression without addressing the sources of suffering. As spring arrived in 1917, Russia found itself suspended between hope and chaos, between the death of the old order and the birth of something entirely unknown. The February Revolution had answered the question of who would not rule the Romanovs were finished forever, but it had not answered the more important question of who would rule or how or according to what principles. That answer lay in the future, in the hands of men who understood that power in revolutionary times belongs not to those who deserve it, but to those who dare to seize it. In railway stations across the empire, sealed trains were beginning to move, carrying exiled revolutionaries back to a homeland they barely recognized. Among them was a man who had spent the war years in Swiss libraries, studying the theories of revolution and waiting for his moment. Vladimir Ilyich Lenin was coming home, and with him, the promise that Russia's revolutionary convulsions had only just begun. The sealed train that carried Vladimir Ilyich Lenin across Germany in April 1917 transported more than a revolutionary. It carried an idea so radical that even his fellow Bolsheviks would initially reject it. Lenin had spent the war years in Swiss exile, watching from afar as the empire of his birth convulsed in revolution, analyzing every development through the lens of Marxist theory and his own implacable will. Now, stepping onto the platform at Petrograd's Finland station on April 3rd, he brought with him a vision that would transform not just Russia, but the entire trajectory of human history. The Bolshevik leaders who welcomed Lenin expected him to support the provisional government, as most socialists were doing, and work toward the gradual transition to socialism that orthodox Marxism predicted. Instead, Lenin delivered what became known as the April Theses, a call for immediate revolution that stunned even his closest followers. The people need peace, the people need bread, the people need land, he declared. And they give you war, hunger, no bread leave the landlord still on the land. These three words, peace, land, bread, became the Bolshevik program, simple enough for any peasant or worker to understand, radical enough to reshape a continent. The genius of Lenin's slogan lay not in its originality but in its honesty. While the provisional government spoke of continuing the war until victory and waiting for the Constituent Assembly to address land reform, Lenin promised immediate solutions to immediate problems. To soldiers dying in pointless offensives, he offered peace. To peasants hungering for land, he offered seizure of noble estates. To workers struggling to feed their families, he offered bread. It was demagogy of the highest order, and it worked because it addressed real suffering with concrete promises. The summer of 1917 became a dress rehearsal for revolution, marked by the chaotic uprising known as the July Days. Soldiers and workers, inspired by Bolshevik agitation but acting without clear leadership, attempted to overthrow the provisional government through street demonstrations and armed attacks. The uprising failed, discredited the Bolsheviks temporarily, and forced Lenin to flee to Finland. But it revealed the weakness of the government and the volatility of popular anger. Like a seismograph recording earth tremors before a major quake, the July Days measured the building pressure that would soon explode into revolution. The event that made Bolshevik victory possible was the bizarre Kornilov affair in September 1917. General Lava Kornilov, appointed commander-in-chief by Alexander Kerensky, marched on Petrograd with the apparent intention of establishing military dictatorship. Whether Kornilov was attempting a coup, responding to Kerensky's confused orders, or trying to restore discipline to a disintegrating nation remains unclear. What matters is that Kerensky, terrified by the prospect of counter-revolution, armed the very Bolsheviks he had been trying to suppress, and appealed for their help in defending the capital. The Bolsheviks responded with enthusiasm, organizing the defense of Petrograd while quietly strengthening their own position. Railway workers sabotaged Kornilov's troop trains. Telegraph operators intercepted his communications. Propaganda teams convinced his soldiers that they were being used against the revolution. The general who had marched to save Russia found his army melting away before it reached the capital. Kornilov's failure discredited the military leadership, weakened the provisional government, and left the Bolsheviks as the only organized force in the capital. By October, Lenin had concluded that the moment for revolution had arrived. The provisional government commanded little loyalty beyond the ministerial offices. The army was disintegrating through desertion and indiscipline. The economy was approaching complete collapse. Most importantly, the other socialist parties had lost credibility through their support of the unpopular war. History will not forgive us if we do not assume power now, Lenin wrote to his hesitant colleagues. The man who had spent his adult life preparing for revolution finally saw his opportunity. The October Revolution, when it came on October 25th, November 7th in the Western calendar, was both more and less dramatic than its myth-makers would later claim. More dramatic because it changed the world, less dramatic because it involved remarkably little actual fighting. The Bolsheviks, led by the brilliant organizer Leon Trotsky, had spent weeks planning every detail of the seizure of power. They knew which bridges to control, which telegraph offices to occupy, which government buildings to surround. When the moment came, they moved with precision that amazed foreign observers. The storming of the Winter Palace, immortalized in Soviet propaganda films, was actually a pathetic anticlimax. The building was defended by a handful of military cadets, a women's battalion, and some Cossacks who departed before the attack began. The Bolsheviks walked through unlocked doors, climbed unguarded staircases, and arrested ministers who were debating whether to flee or surrender. The government that had inherited the authority of centuries fell to a few hundred determined revolutionaries in a single evening. The ease of the Bolshevik victory masked its fundamental illegitimacy. Lenin's party represented perhaps 200,000 members in a nation of 150 million. They had seized power not through popular mandate, but through superior organization and willingness to use force. Their first acts revealed the authoritarian nature of their revolution, dissolving the provisional government, arresting opposition leaders, and beginning the systematic suppression of all competing political movements. The Constituent Assembly, elected in November 1917 in Russia's first and last free election, gave the Bolsheviks only 24% of the vote, compared to 40% for the socialist revolutionaries. Lenin's response was characteristically direct. When the assembly convened in January 1918, Bolshevik Guards simply ordered the delegates to leave. The Constituent Assembly, Lenin declared, represents the old world when power was in the hands of the compromisers and the cadets. Democracy, in his view, was a bourgeois luxury that revolutionary Russia could not afford. The dissolution of the Constituent Assembly marked the true beginning of the Russian Civil War. Though fighting had been sporadic since the Bolshevik seizure of power, General Alexei Kalydin declared his independence in the Don Cossack territories. Czech prisoners of war stranded across Siberia began fighting their way to Pacific ports. Former imperial officers gathered in the south, forming the nucleus of what would become the White Army. The empire that had held together through 3 centuries of expansion and crisis was finally tearing apart at the seams. Yet even as civil war began, Lenin moved quickly to fulfill his most popular promise, peace with Germany. The Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, signed in March 1918, was a catastrophic surrender that cost Russia Poland, the Baltic provinces, Ukraine, and vast territories in the Caucasus. The peace freed German divisions for the Western Front, but gave Lenin what he most needed, time to consolidate power and organize his forces for the domestic war he knew was coming. As 1918 dawned, the revolution had passed beyond the point of no return. The old order was dead, but the new order existed only in Lenin's imagination and in the decrees issuing from the commandeered offices of Petrograd. Across the vast expanses of the former empire, armies were forming, alliances shifting, and ordinary people were discovering that revolution meant not liberation, but a different, perhaps worse, form of tyranny. The empire had survived the Mongol yoke, the time of troubles, and Napoleon's invasion. It would not survive the revolution that promised to save it. In the spring of 1918, as civil war consumed the Russian countryside and foreign armies gathered on the borders, a family of 7 lived in exile in the Siberian town of Tobolsk. Their days measured not by state ceremonies or imperial progresses, but by the simple rhythms of captivity. Nicholas Romanov, no longer styled His Imperial Majesty, spent his mornings reading to his children, his afternoons sawing wood, his evenings playing cards with his wife. For a man who had never wanted to be emperor, these months of imprisonment might have been the happiest of his adult life, had he not known they would also be his last. The provisional government had initially planned to send the royal family to England, where Nicholas's cousin, King George V, would provide sanctuary. But as revolution deepened and popular anger intensified, even this modest gesture became politically impossible. George V, fearing that harbouring the Russian Tsar might destabilize his own throne, quietly withdrew the invitation. Other European monarchs, themselves trembling before revolutionary winds, found excuses to refuse asylum. The man who had once been autocrat of 1/6 of the Earth's surface became a prisoner without a country, unwanted by relatives who had once courted his favour. The Bolshevik seizure of power sealed the family's fate. Though the end came slowly, almost reluctantly, Lenin understood that keeping Nicholas alive posed certain risks. He could become a rallying point for counter-revolution, but executing him posed others, potentially alienating foreign governments whose recognition the new regime desperately needed. For months the Bolshevik leadership debated what to do with their unwanted inheritance from the collapsed monarchy. The decision to move the family from Tobolsk to Ekaterinburg in April 1918 marked the beginning of the end. The Ural Regional Soviet, dominated by hardline Bolsheviks who saw any compromise as betrayal, had no patience for Moscow's hesitations. They housed the Romanovs in the Ipatiev House, a commandeered mansion that locals soon began calling the House of Special Purpose, a euphemism that fooled no one about its intended function. The family's captivity in Ekaterinburg was harsher than their exile in Tobolsk had been. Their guards were deliberately chosen from among the most revolutionary workers and soldiers, men who viewed their former emperor not as a fallen human being deserving compassion, but as a symbol of centuries of oppression. Windows were painted over to prevent the prisoners from seeing outside or others from seeing in. Meals became irregular and deliberately unappetizing. Most cruelly, the guards amused themselves by writing obscene graffiti about the Empress on the walls of their rooms. Yet even in these degraded circumstances, the family maintained a dignity that impressed some of their captors. Nicholas continued to read aloud to his children each evening. Alexandra, despite her chronic pain and growing despair, insisted on maintaining the elaborate court etiquette that had governed their former lives. The children Olga, Tatiana, Maria, Anastasia, and young Alexei played games, studied languages, and cared for their parents with a devotion that humanized them in the eyes of those who had been taught to see them as enemies of the people. The decision to execute the family was made not in Moscow but in Ekaterinburg, by local Bolsheviks who claimed they were acting to prevent the Romanovs from falling into the hands of the advancing Czech Legion and White Army forces. Whether Lenin personally ordered the executions or merely gave tacit consent to a local initiative remains historically uncertain. What is clear is that by July 1918, keeping the royal family alive had become impossible for a regime fighting for its survival against enemies who would certainly use Nicholas as a legitimizing symbol. On the night of July 16th and 17, 1918, the family was awakened and told they were being moved to a safer location. They dressed quickly, the daughters sewing jewellery into their corsets, a precaution that would prove tragically useless. In the basement of the Ipatiev house, they were arranged for what they were told would be a group photograph. Instead, Yakov Yurovsky, the chief executioner, read a brief statement about their fate and opened fire with a pistol. The execution that followed was bungled with a thoroughness that matched the incompetence of the old regime the victims had once symbolized. The jewels sewn into the daughters' clothing deflected some bullets, prolonging their agony. Alexei survived the initial volley and had to be finished with bayonets. The room filled with smoke and screams, chaos and blood. When it was over, 11 people were dead. The imperial family, their doctor, and 3 servants who had remained loyal through imprisonment and execution. The bodies were disposed of with the same brutal efficiency the Bolsheviks brought to other aspects of revolution. They were taken to an abandoned mineshaft doused with acid and gasoline and burned. The remains were buried in unmarked graves that would not be discovered for decades. The dynasty that had ruled Russia for 3 centuries vanished into the Siberian earth as completely as if it had never existed. The murder of the Romanovs marked more than the end of a family, it symbolized the death of Imperial Russia itself. The empire that had survived the Mongol invasion, the time of troubles, Napoleon's march to Moscow, and countless peasant uprisings could not survive the ideology that promised to liberate humanity through violence. The Third Rome, which had claimed to be eternal, proved as mortal as its predecessors, yet the empire's death throes continued long after the royal family's execution. The Russian Civil War that raged from 1918 to 1921 was fought not just between Reds and Whites, but among dozens of factions with competing visions of Russia's future. The White Army, led by former imperial generals like Anton Denikin and Alexander Kolchak, fought to restore traditional authority, but could never decide whether they wanted constitutional monarchy, military dictatorship, or democratic republic. The Green Army represented peasant anarchism, rejecting both communist revolution and capitalist restoration. Regional warlords carved out personal fiefdoms. Ethnic minorities declared independence. Foreign armies from 14 nations intervened, ostensibly to oppose Bolshevism but actually to advance their own territorial ambitions. In this chaos, the empire's borderlands broke away like ice breaking from a glacier in spring. Poland declared independence and successfully defended it in war against the new Soviet state. Finland, the Baltic states of Estonia, Latvia and Lithuania, established their freedom and maintained it through the interwar period. Romania seized Bessarabia. Turkey reclaimed territories in the Caucasus. For a brief moment it seemed as though the Russian Empire might fragment completely, leaving only the ethnic Russian heartland under Bolshevik control. But Lenin and his successors proved remarkably successful at rebuilding the empire under new ideological colours. Where the Tsars had used Orthodox Christianity to justify expansion, the Bolsheviks used international socialism. Where the old regime had spoken of civilizing barbarian peoples, the new one promised to liberate oppressed nationalities from capitalist exploitation. The methods remained remarkably similar. Centralized control from Moscow, suppression of local autonomy, colonization by ethnic Russians, and the use of force against any resistance. The Soviet Union that emerged from civil war in 1922 encompassed roughly the same territory as the Russian Empire, minus only Poland, Finland and the Baltics. Ukraine, reconquered after bitter fighting, found Soviet rule even more oppressive than Tsarist domination. The Caucasus republics of Georgia, Armenia and Azerbaijan were absorbed through a combination of military conquest and political manipulation. Central Asia, never seriously contested during the Civil War, remained under Moscow's control with barely a change in administration. Most remarkably, the new regime preserved many of the old empire's administrative structures and governing philosophies. The Cheka, successor to the Okhrana, employed many of the same personnel and techniques as the Tsarist secret police. The Communist Party's centralized hierarchy mirrored the old bureaucracy's command structure. Even the capital remained in the same location, though Petrograd was renamed Leningrad. Governmental power still radiated outward from the same palaces where Tsars had once held court. As we watch the Russian Empire die and the Soviet Union rise from its ashes, we see one of history's greatest ironies. The revolution that promised to destroy the old order succeeded mainly in changing its rhetoric. The new state would prove more centralized than the old, more repressive than the Tsars had ever been, more expansionist than even Catherine the Great had dreamed. The empire died, but its methods and ambitions lived on in revolutionary clothing. In the basement of the Ipatiev house, more than a family had perished. An idea had died as well. The notion that Russia required traditional monarchy to hold its vast territories together proved false. Communist dictatorship would serve the same function even more effectively. The Romanovs were gone forever, but their empire, transformed beyond recognition yet somehow familiar, would persist for another 70 years, awaiting its own revolutionary moment and its own final reckoning with the forces of change. As we sit in the ruins of empire amid the ashes of dynasty and the silence where once imperial eagles soared, we might ask what remains when the crowns are melted down and the palaces emptied. The Russian Empire that died in basement execution and civil war left behind something more enduring than territorial boundaries or political systems. It left a civilization whose echoes still resonate through the corridors of human consciousness, whose achievements in art and architecture, literature and music continue to move hearts and stir souls across the world. In a modest country estate called Yasnaya Polyana, an old count sat at his writing desk as the 20th century dawned, crafting sentences that would outlive all the military victories his ancestors had won. Leo Tolstoy, descendant of the nobility that had served Tsars for centuries, created in War and Peace and Anna Karenina works that captured not just Russian society, but the universal human condition with a depth and breadth that few writers have ever achieved. His novels were more than entertainment. They were explorations of how individuals navigate the great forces of history, how love and death, war and peace, ambition and resignation shape the human experience. Tolstoy's genius lay not just in his storytelling but in his moral vision. He understood that the Empire's greatest achievements and deepest failures sprang from the same source, the Russian soul's capacity for both transcendent spirituality and earthly suffering. When Prince Andrei lies wounded on the battlefield at Austerlitz, gazing up at the infinite sky, he experiences a revelation about the vanity of worldly ambition that speaks to readers of every nationality and era. When Anna Karenina throws herself under the train, her tragedy becomes a meditation on the conflict between individual desire and social expectation that transcends the specific circumstances of 19th century Russia. Across the literary landscape, other giants of Russian literature were exploring different aspects of the imperial experience. Fyodor Dostoevsky, shaped by imprisonment and exile, delved into the psychological depths of guilt, redemption, and spiritual crisis. The Underground Man, Raskolnikov, the Grand Inquisitor. These characters emerged from specifically Russian conditions, yet spoke to universal questions about freedom, responsibility, and the meaning of existence. Crime and Punishment and The Brothers. Karamazov were not merely novels, but philosophical inquiries into the nature of good and evil, faith and doubt. Ivan Turgenev captured the melancholy beauty of rural Russia and the tragic idealism of its educated youth. Alexander Pushkin, the Empire's first great literary voice, had earlier created a poetic language that gave Russians a way to understand themselves and their place in European civilization. Anton Chekhov, writing as the old order crumbled, found in the declining nobility and emerging middle class the material for stories and plays that revealed the poignant comedy of human aspiration and disappointment. This literary flowering was paralleled by achievements in music that gave the world some of its most beloved melodies and most profound emotional experiences. Pyotr Ilyich Tchaikovsky transformed Russian folk themes and Orthodox liturgical traditions into symphonies and ballets that spoke a universal language of beauty and longing. The Nutcracker and Swan Lake, the 1812 Overture and Piano Concerto No. 1, became part of humanity's shared cultural inheritance. Performed in concert halls from New York to Tokyo, beloved by audiences who might know nothing of the empire that produced them. The group of composers known as the Five Mussorgsky, Rimsky-Korsakov, Borodin, Cui and Balakirev, deliberately sought to create a distinctly Russian musical voice, incorporating folk melodies, oriental themes from the empire's Asian territories, and the rhythms of Russian speech into their compositions. Modest Mussorgsky's pictures at an exhibition, and Boris Godunov captured both the grandeur and the torment of Russian history. Nikolai Rimsky-Korsakov's Scheherazade evoked the exotic Orient that had always fascinated Russian imaginations. The empire's architectural legacy stands as a testament to the marriage between European sophistication and Russian vision. The Moscow Kremlin, with its mixture of Byzantine, Italian Renaissance and traditional Russian elements, created a unique aesthetic that was both familiar and mysterious. The onion domes of St. Basil's Cathedral seemed to capture the very essence of Russian spirituality, reaching toward heaven while remaining rooted in earthly soil. St. Petersburg, Peter the Great's window to Europe, became a living museum of imperial ambition translated into stone and gold. The Winter Palace, designed by Italian architects but built by Russian craftsmen, housed the Hermitage Collection, one of the world's great treasures of human artistic achievement. The Peterhof Palace and gardens rivaled Versailles in magnificence, while expressing a distinctly Russian sense of scale and grandeur. These buildings were not mere displays of wealth, but attempts to create physical manifestations of imperial ideology, spaces where the divine right of kings could be experienced through architectural splendor. Perhaps the empire's greatest achievement, however, was its creation of a multi-ethnic civilization that, despite its many failures and injustices, provided a framework within which dozens of distinct peoples could coexist and contribute to a shared culture. The empire at its height contained more than 100 different nationalities, each with its own language, customs and traditions. While Russification policies often suppressed this diversity, the empire also created spaces where different cultures could interact and influence each other. In the army, a Georgian prince might serve alongside a Baltic German baron and a Ukrainian peasant, all united by loyalty to the Tsar. In the universities, students from Finland might study with classmates from Central Asia, all learning in Russian but bringing their own cultural perspectives to their studies. The Orthodox Church, while serving as an instrument of Russian cultural hegemony, also provided a common spiritual framework that transcended ethnic boundaries. Orthodox Christianity itself became one of the empire's most enduring legacies, not merely as a religious system, but as a civilizational force that shaped Russian approaches to art, politics, and social organization. The Orthodox emphasis on communal worship and collective responsibility influenced Russian attitudes toward individual rights and social obligations. The mystical tradition within Orthodoxy, with its emphasis on direct spiritual experience, shaped Russian approaches to literature and philosophy. The Church's role as guardian of traditional values provided stability during times of rapid change, while also creating resistance to modernization. The idea of Russia as a unique civilization, neither fully European nor Asian but something distinctive, emerged from the empire's geographical position and historical experience. This concept of Russian exceptionalism, the notion that Russia had a special destiny and mission in world history, would survive the empire's collapse and continue to influence Russian thinking into the modern era, whether expressed through the ideology of Moscow as the Third Rome, the Slavophil movement's celebration of Russian spiritual superiority, or the communist vision of Russia as the leader of world revolution. This sense of special mission remained a constant theme. As we contemplate these achievements, we must acknowledge that they emerged not despite the empire's authoritarian nature, but often because of it. The cultural patronage that supported Tchaikovsky and Tolstoy was made possible by the wealth extracted from serf labor. The architectural marvels of St. Petersburg were built on the bones of peasants who died in the marshes. The multi-ethnic empire that produced such cultural richness was also the source of oppression and suffering for millions of its subjects. Yet the works remain, outlasting the political system that created them, speaking to something deeper and more enduring than imperial ambition. When we listen to Rachmaninoff's Piano Concerto No, to or read Anna Karenina, when we marvel at the golden domes of an Orthodox cathedral or study a painting in the Hermitage, we encounter not the Russian Empire's politics, but its soul, that mysterious combination of suffering and beauty, grandeur and melancholy, earthiness and transcendence that defined Russian civilization at its finest moments. This cultural legacy reminds us that empires, whatever their crimes and failures, can also serve as crucibles for human creativity and achievement. The Russian Empire was many things: oppressive, expansionist, often cruel, but it was also the matrix from which emerged some of humanity's greatest artistic and intellectual treasures. In the end, perhaps this is how we should judge it. Not by the wars it fought or the territories it conquered, but by the beauty it created and the truths it revealed about the human condition. As we near the end of our long journey through the centuries of Russian imperial history, we find ourselves confronting questions that have puzzled historians, philosophers, and the Russian people themselves. Was autocracy truly Russia's destiny, written into its geography and character? Could the empire have evolved differently, or were the patterns we have witnessed? Expansion and contraction, reform and reaction, grandeur and collapse as inevitable as the changing of seasons. In the quiet of this moment, as we prepare to close the book on 1,000 years of imperial dreams, let us reflect on the deeper currents that shaped this vast human enterprise. The pendulum of Russian history swung with remarkable consistency between moments of opening to the world and periods of withdrawal from it. Even the terrible expanded the empire dramatically, then turned inward in paranoid fury. Peter the Great forced Russia toward Europe, but his successors oscillated between embracing and rejecting Western influence. Alexander II freed the serfs and introduced constitutional elements, but his son Alexander III returned to rigid autocracy. Each reforming Tsar seemed to provoke an equal and opposite reaction. as if Russian society could never maintain equilibrium between tradition and change. This pattern suggests something profound about the Russian imperial experience, that the very size and diversity of the empire made gradual, peaceful evolution extraordinarily difficult. Unlike smaller European nations that could modify their institutions incrementally, Russia faced the challenge of governing 1/6 of the Earth's land surface, containing dozens of ethnic groups with conflicting interests and loyalties. Any change in such a vast system created unpredictable consequences, like a stone thrown into a still lake, sending ripples across thousands of miles and millions of lives. The geography that made Russia powerful also made it vulnerable. The endless steppes that allowed expansion also provided no natural boundaries against invasion. The severe climate that hardened Russian character also made agriculture precarious and economic development difficult. The vast distances that protected the empire's heartland also made communication and control enormously challenging. Russian rulers, whether Tsars or commissars, consistently concluded that only the most centralized authoritarian government could hold such an unwieldy territory together. Perhaps autocracy was not so much Russia's choice as its burden, the price of maintaining unity across such vast and diverse territories. Every attempt to share power or decentralize authority seemed to threaten the empire's cohesion. The Decembrists' constitutional dreams led to 30 years of reactionary rule under Nicholas III. Alexander II's reforms unleashed forces that ultimately destroyed the monarchy. Even the February Revolution's brief experiment with democracy quickly gave way to Bolshevik dictatorship. Russian history seemed to teach the lesson that liberalism was a luxury the empire could not afford. Yet this conclusion raises troubling questions about the relationship between empire and freedom. The Roman Empire had evolved from republic to autocracy as it expanded. The British Empire, despite its constitutional government at home, ruled its colonies with authoritarian methods. Perhaps the problem lay not with Russian character but with the nature of imperial rule itself. Empires, by definition, involve the domination of some peoples by others, and such domination may require authoritarian methods regardless of the dominant nation's political traditions. The price of maintaining this empire was paid in the currency of human suffering on an almost incomprehensible scale. Serfdom, that peculiar institution that bound millions to the soil, persisted in Russia long after it had disappeared elsewhere in Europe precisely because the empire's economic and social system depended on the unfree labour of the majority. The military colonies, the brutal conscription system, the exile of dissidents to Siberia, the periodic famines that claimed millions of lives, all were consequences of the imperial system's demands for resources and control. The empire's ethnic minorities paid an equally heavy price. The Russification policies that sought to create one Tsar, one faith, one language attempted cultural genocide on a massive scale. Polish rebellions were crushed with systematic brutality. Jewish pogroms were tacitly encouraged as a safety valve for popular discontent. The conquest of Central Asia and the Caucasus involved the subjugation of ancient civilizations and the suppression of local autonomy. The empire that prided itself on bringing civilization to backward peoples often destroyed more than it created. Perhaps most tragically, the Russian people themselves bore the heaviest burden of their empire's greatness. The peasants who died building St. Petersburg, the soldiers who perished in countless wars of expansion, the generations who lived in poverty and ignorance so that their rulers could maintain magnificent courts, these were the true costs of imperial ambition. Russian literature captured this tragedy with unmatched poignancy. From Pushkin's Bronze Horseman, trampling the little man underfoot, to Tolstoy's peasant soldiers, dying for causes they never understood. The question of modernization versus tradition haunted every Russian ruler. Peter the Great's brutal westernization created a dual society, a European elite ruling over a medieval peasantry. Catherine the Great's Enlightenment ideals coexisted with the expansion of serfdom. Alexander II's great reforms failed to prevent revolutionary terror. The empire seemed caught in a permanent contradiction between its desire to compete with Western nations and its fear that Western ideas would destroy its traditional foundations. This contradiction was particularly acute because Russia's imperial ideology depended heavily on claims of spiritual and cultural superiority over the materialistic West. The concept of Moscow as the Third Rome, the Slavophil celebration of Russian communalism, the Orthodox emphasis on spiritual values over worldly success, all serve to justify Russian backwardness as evidence of higher virtue. Yet this same ideology made it difficult to acknowledge that Russia needed to learn from the very nations it claimed to surpass. Why do empires fall? The Russian case suggests several fatal patterns that seem to affect all great imperial systems. First, there is the problem of overextension, the tendency to expand beyond the capacity to effectively govern and defend new territories. The Russian Empire at its height was simply too large to be administered efficiently with pre-modern communication and transportation technology. Local officials operated with enormous autonomy. Corruption became endemic, and central control remained largely theoretical across vast regions. Second, there is the rigidity that comes from success. The methods that built the empire autocracy, serfdom, military expansion, became so identified with Russian greatness that questioning them seemed treasonous. Each crisis was met with more of the same medicine, even when that medicine had become poison. The empire's inability to evolve peacefully made violent revolution almost inevitable. Third, there is the loss of legitimacy that occurs when an empire's promises to its people are repeatedly broken. The Russian Empire promised protection to its subjects but could not defend them from foreign invasion. It promised justice but delivered arbitrary rule. It promised prosperity but maintained most of its population in poverty. Eventually, the gap between imperial ideology and imperial reality became too great to sustain belief. Finally, there is the danger of what we might call imperial hubris, the belief that size and power exempt a nation from the normal rules of political and economic development. Russian rulers consistently believed that their empire's vastness made it invulnerable to the forces that had destroyed other great powers. They failed to understand that in the modern world efficiency matters more than size, adaptation more than tradition, legitimacy more than force. Yet as we contemplate these eternal patterns of imperial rise and fall, we must also acknowledge what made the Russian Empire unique. No other nation has ever governed such vast territories for so long. No other empire has produced such extraordinary achievements in literature, music, and the arts. No other imperial system has so profoundly shaped the consciousness of its people, creating a sense of national mission and destiny that survived even the empire's collapse. The Russian Empire's greatest legacy may be its demonstration that human beings can create political systems of extraordinary grandeur and terrible cost, that the same impulses that produced Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky can also produce the knout and the exile's chain. It reminds us that empires are human creations, subject to human flaws and capable of both sublime achievement and horrific failure. As our long story draws to a close, we might reflect on what the Russian imperial experience teaches us about power, about the price of greatness, about the eternal human tension between order and freedom. The empire that began with Viking traders on Russian rivers and ended in a basement in Ekaterinburg encompassed almost the entire range of human political experience, from the heights of cultural achievement to the depths of oppression and violence. In the end, perhaps that is the Russian Empire's most important message, that all human institutions, no matter how powerful or enduring, are temporary arrangements subject to the inexorable forces of historical change. The Third Rome fell as surely as the first two, reminding us that even the mightiest empires are, in the grand sweep of history, temporary arrangements in humanity's long search for justice, prosperity, and meaning. When Vladimir Lenin proclaimed the birth of the Soviet Union in 1922, he believed he was creating something entirely new, a workers' state that would break forever with the oppressive traditions of Tsarist Russia. Yet as we watch the Bolsheviks consolidate their power, we see the ghost of the old empire rising from its grave, wearing revolutionary clothes but following patterns as ancient as the first princes of Kiev. The Soviet Union would prove to be not the antithesis of Russian imperialism, but its most successful incarnation, achieving through communist ideology what the Tsars had attempted through orthodox autocracy. The geographical continuity was striking. The USSR encompassed almost exactly the same territory as the Russian Empire at its height, minus only Poland, Finland and the Baltic states. Ukraine, reconquered through civil war, found Soviet rule more oppressive than anything the Tsars had imposed. The Caucasus republics discovered that internationalist socialism looked remarkably like Russian imperialism when viewed from Tbilisi or Yerevan. Central Asian peoples learned that Soviet modernization meant the same cultural suppression and Russian colonization their ancestors had experienced under the Romanovs. Stalin, the Georgian who became more Russian than the Russians, perfected the imperial methods his predecessors had only dreamed of implementing. Where the Tsars had maintained a secret police, Stalin created a security apparatus that penetrated every aspect of society. Where the old regime had exiled dissidents to Siberia, Stalin sent millions to a vast archipelago of labor camps that stretched across the frozen wastes. Where Tsarist censorship had been sporadic and sometimes ineffective, Soviet control of information was total and systematic. The cult of personality that surrounded Stalin echoed the divine right of kings with uncanny precision. His portraits hung in every public building, his statues dominated city squares, his words were treated as infallible truth. The Communist Party's Central Committee functioned like an imperial council, concentrating power in a small group of men who ruled through a combination of terror and bureaucratic control. The Soviet Union had abolished the Tsar only to create something far more powerful, an emperor, who claimed to rule not by God's will but by historical necessity. Even the empire's expansion followed familiar patterns. The Tsars had pushed westward into Poland, southward into the Caucasus, and eastward across Siberia, always justifying conquest as a civilizing mission. The Soviets pushed westward into Eastern Europe, southward into Afghanistan, and projected power globally, always justifying expansion as liberation of oppressed peoples from capitalist exploitation. The rhetoric changed, but the drive to dominate neighboring territories remained constant. The parallels extended to domestic policy as well. Soviet collectivization, which destroyed millions of peasant farmers, achieved what centuries of Tsarist policy had failed to accomplish: the complete subordination of rural Russia to state control. The 5-year plans that industrialized the USSR recapitulated Peter the Great's forced modernization, achieving dramatic results through massive human sacrifice. Even Soviet atheism paradoxically resembled Orthodox Christianity in its demand for absolute faith and its intolerance of competing beliefs. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed in 1991, the empire's ghost proved remarkably persistent. The Russian Federation that emerged from the USSR's ruins struggled with the same fundamental questions that had plagued the Tsar's how: to govern vast territories populated by diverse peoples, how to balance European aspirations with Asian realities, how to maintain great power status while ensuring domestic prosperity. The patterns of centralized rule, suspicion of Western influence, and messianic sense of special destiny proved remarkably durable. Modern Russia's leaders have explicitly embraced this imperial inheritance. The double-headed eagle has returned as the national symbol. Orthodox Christianity has been restored as a pillar of state ideology. The concept of Russia as a unique civilization with its own values and destiny has been revived. Most significantly, the drive to dominate neighboring territories has reasserted itself through military intervention, economic coercion, and information warfare. The methods are modern, but the impulses are ancient. This continuity across centuries of political upheaval suggests profound lessons about the nature of power and the difficulty of escaping historical patterns. Absolutism, whether justified by divine right, historical materialism, or national security, seems to create similar results regardless of its ideological foundation. The concentration of power in a single person or small group inevitably leads to corruption, paranoia, and the suppression of dissent. The promise to create paradise through authoritarian methods invariably produces earthly hell for those who dare to question authority. Perhaps most tragically, Russian history reveals the enormous cost of missed opportunities for peaceful evolution. The Decembrists' constitutional monarchy, the Zemstvo liberals' gradual democracy, Stolypin's agricultural reforms, the provisional government's parliamentary experiment, each represented a path not taken, a chance to modernize without the catastrophic violence that marked Russia's actual development. The empire's inability to evolve peacefully condemned it to cycles of stagnation and revolutionary upheaval that cost tens of millions of lives. The tragedy extends beyond Russia's borders. The empire's authoritarian model influenced other nations struggling to modernize rapidly, from Meiji Japan to contemporary China. The Soviet example inspired revolutionary movements worldwide, spreading the belief that political goals justify unlimited means. Even today, authoritarian leaders point to Russian history as evidence that strong rule is necessary for national greatness, that democracy is a luxury poor nations cannot afford. Yet Russian history also demonstrates the ultimate futility of trying to build lasting institutions on fear and force alone. The Mongol yoke lasted for centuries but eventually crumbled. The Tsarist system survived numerous crises but could not adapt to modern warfare's demands. The Soviet Union achieved superpower status but collapsed when its people lost faith in its promises. Each authoritarian system, no matter how powerful, eventually faced the same problem. Rulers who depend on fear must constantly escalate repression to maintain control until the cost of maintaining power exceeds the benefits it provides. The human cost of these imperial ambitions defies calculation. The peasants who died building St. Petersburg, the millions who perished in Stalin's camps, the soldiers who fell in Afghanistan, their suffering purchased temporary glory for rulers whose names are now historical curiosities. The great achievements of Russian civilization, the literature, music and art we celebrated earlier, emerged not because of authoritarianism but despite it, created by individuals who found ways to express truth and beauty even under oppressive conditions. As we contemplate these patterns, we might ask whether they represent inevitable features of human nature or choices that could have been made differently. Russian history suggests that geography and culture create certain tendencies, but they do not determine destiny. Other large diverse nations have found ways to balance unity with diversity, strength with freedom, tradition with progress. The tragedy of Russian imperialism may lie not in its inevitability but in its persistence. The way each generation of leaders chose the familiar path of authoritarian control rather than the difficult journey toward genuinely representative government. The ghost of the Russian Empire continues to haunt not just Russia, but the world. Its model of authoritarian modernization appeals to leaders who want rapid development without political competition. Its example of great power projection through military force and sphere of influence politics influences international relations. Its demonstration that ordinary people can be mobilized for extraordinary sacrifices in pursuit of imperial dreams continues to inspire and terrify. Yet as we near the end of our long journey through Russian imperial history, we might also reflect on what has been lost. The empire that once stretched across 11 time zones has contracted to its ethnic heartland. The superpower that once competed with America for global dominance struggles to maintain influence in its immediate neighborhood. The civilization that produced Tolstoy and Tchaikovsky now exports mainly raw materials and authoritarian methods. The dreams of imperial greatness have given way to the reality of demographic decline and economic stagnation. The empire sleeps now in history's pages, but its dreams and nightmares echo still in the palaces of power and the hearts of peoples across the vast Eurasian landmass. Its story reminds us that the human desire for greatness, however noble, can exact a price in suffering that outlasts any temporary glory. In the quiet of this moment, as we prepare to close this long chapter of human experience, we might pause to remember not just the emperors and their conquests, but the countless ordinary people whose lives were shaped, and too often broken, by imperial ambitions they had no voice in choosing. Sleep now, dear friend, and let your dreams carry you across the vast steppes where this story began, where Viking longships once cut through waters that reflected no cities, no churches, no palaces, only sky and forest stretching to the edge of imagination. Feel yourself drifting like snow across those endless plains where, for 1,000 years, the drama of empire unfolded in acts of triumph and tragedy, glory and suffering, wisdom and folly that reveal the full spectrum of human possibility. The Russian Empire stands before us now as one of history's great mirrors, reflecting not just the particular circumstances of Slavic civilization, but the eternal patterns of human ambition and frailty. In its rise, we see our species' magnificent capacity for creation, the ability to build cities from swamps, to bind vast territories with roads and laws, to create works of art that speak across centuries to souls yet unborn. In its fall, we witness our equally powerful capacity for destruction, the way power corrupts those who wield it, the price paid by millions for the dreams of the few, the inevitable collapse that awaits all human institutions that forget their purpose is to serve rather than to rule. How many empires have we watched rise and fall across the centuries of human experience? Egyptian pharaohs once ruled as gods, yet their pyramids now stand empty monuments to vanished glory. Roman legions conquered the known world, yet their eagles gather dust in museums. The British Empire spanned the globe, proclaiming that the sun would never set on its dominions, yet sunset came nonetheless. Each believed in its own permanence, its special destiny, its exemption from the ordinary laws of historical change. Each discovered that even the mightiest human creations are temporary arrangements in time's vast passage. Yet from each of these fallen empires something endures, not the borders or the armies or the systems of control, but the art and literature, the ideas and innovations, the glimpses of beauty and truth that human creativity manages to preserve even amid political chaos. The Russian Empire, for all its failures and cruelties, gave us Tolstoy's insights into the human heart, Tchaikovsky's sublime melodies, architectural marvels that still inspire wonder, and a literary tradition that continues to illuminate the depths of human experience. Perhaps this is what we should take from our long journey through Russian imperial history, not the cautionary tale of power's corruption, though that lesson is important, but the more hopeful recognition that human creativity can transcend the political systems that contain it. The serf who carved a wooden toy, the provincial musician who composed a forgotten melody, the village storyteller who preserved ancient folk tales. These unnamed individuals contributed as much to Russian civilization's lasting value as any emperor who conquered territories or built palaces. As you drift towards sleep, let your mind wander through those imagined landscapes. The golden domes of Orthodox churches catching the first light of dawn, the endless birch forests where sunbeams filter through silver leaves, the frozen rivers that once carried traders and armies across the continent, the cities where European elegance married Asian mystery to create something uniquely beautiful. These images persist not because of imperial power, but because of the human capacity to find and create beauty, even in the most unlikely circumstances. The empire that began with traders on Russian rivers has returned to the realm of memory and dream. But the rivers still flow, the forests still whisper with wind, and the vast sky still arches over steppes where new stories wait to unfold. In this continuity of landscape and humanity, we find perhaps the only permanence available to our species, not in the institutions we build, but in the love and creativity and hope that survive all of our political arrangements. Rest well, knowing that you have witnessed one of history's great human adventures in all its complexity and contradiction. Let the gentle rhythms of this ancient story carry you into peaceful dreams, where empires rise and fall like waves on distant shores, where the struggles of emperors and subjects alike become part of the vast, ongoing conversation between human ambition and the eternal mysteries that surround our brief passage through time. The Russian Empire sleeps now in history's pages, its dreams and nightmares echoing still through the chambers of human memory, reminding us that we too are part of this great human story, that our choices and actions will someday become part of the long tale that future generations tell about their ancestors' hopes and fears, triumphs and failures. In the endless human search for meaning, beauty, and home, sleep peacefully and dream of snow falling gently on empty thrones, of time's patient work transforming all human glory into stories told by quiet voices in the peaceful darkness of night.